Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 81, Der Therema. He'd come prepared then, wearing my sylvanwood ring like a prop. Not once had he ever acknowledged taking it, but I'd always known. There was so much I'd always known, and so much I'd let myself forget. Like his dripping disdain for the elves after our victory in Halam Shirel, or the condescending smile he reserved for the occasions I spoke of my faith. Joven eyed the ring, but made no move to touch it. He understood its significance far more than Salas ever would. He'd been there as I scrambled to pull it off my keeper's finger before the burning Araval took it with her, when it hadn't even begun to give until her hand was soaked in blood and I was smothering under the veil, fade-touched thoughts encroaching on the waking world as whatever toxin Joven painted on his knife finally had its way. His tightened his grip around my waist as my knees gave out, but I'd no doubt his eyes remained fixed on Salas. Which god do you serve? The one bleeding in your arms, Salas spat, his anger unleashed as I'd only ever seen it once before. If you pray, pray for mercy. Elgarnan knows nothing of vengeance compared to the god whose herald you threaten. Every pain she suffers echoes through the fade, taunting the one whose power gives her life. Salas invoked blasphemies I didn't dare to speak, repackaging my clumsy bluff into something Joven couldn't help but believe. Ma Sa played the game as skillfully as an Orlshian, but he was hamstrung by my ill-advised confession. If he'd doubted Salas was Elvain, he believed it now. I could feel it in the way he held me, in the uptick of his heart against my back, in the quickness of each breath. He often approached the gods as only a rogue could, but Joven was as devout as any Dalish. His voice dropped to the barest whisper. Who are you? Der Therema. A blur of light consumed my vision and I nearly fell to my knees, suddenly unsupported. It took a second to pivot around, yet another to realize that Salas had fade-stepped through me to pin Joven against the wall. Only this time, the faint glow of a paralysis rune lit the darkness. Where is it? Salas demanded, one hand holding my lethalin's dagger against his own throat and the other skimming along his leathers as if Joven were fool enough to craft a poison whose antidote could be stolen. I staggered forward, throwing out an arm to catch myself against Salas even as I spent the last of my mana to slip a barrier between Joven and the knife. There was little chance Salas would kill him, but the gesture mattered. To them both, albeit in different ways. Let him go, Salas. He didn't want to, but after delivering that pile of halashit about my godhood he could hardly say no. The glyph binding Joven dissolved and he glided from the wall as gracefully as if he'd always meant to be there. Without even pausing to acknowledge anything that had happened, he cupped my face in his hands, tipping my head back as his mouth met my throat. The Vandal aria on his tongue felt effervescent against the open wound, a fizz-a-tingle of flesh knitting together with the alchemy of a tempest. He kissed me then, a gesture laced with more than an antidote, but a goodbye. Even if I lived, nothing would be the same once the orb was recovered. Joven's gaze flickered from me to Salas, and I wondered if that's how I'd looked at Abelas in the Temple of Mythalod expectant. He mustered a shadow of his usual grin, the corners weighted by every lie he'd mistaken for the truth. Ir Abelas, he hesitated, tracing his thumb along the memory of my Valislin. What should I tell Fanan? I wouldn't say anything in front of Salas, but I leveled Joven with a look he wouldn't misunderstand. He worked his jaw and I thought for a moment he'd surely say something else, but instead he simply walked out the door. It was only then that I realized I'd been hanging onto Salas all along, his tunic fisted tightly in my anchored hand. I stared at it longer than I should have, as if it belonged to someone else and not me, then willed my fingers to unfurl. I forced my hand to my side, blinked back the pain that bubbled up with the battle behind me. There would be another battle yet. There always was with Salas whenever the Dalish were concerned. Inquisitor. The obsidian chain was coiled up in his outstretched palm, my sylvanwood ring resting on top. I thought of the night before Halam Shirel when I'd gone drinking with Blackwell, how I'd crawled into bed with Salas, for once too naked and drunk to pretend that he'd ever meant to stay. I already said you can keep it. It wouldn't be right. His voice was as soft as it had been in Haven, in Crestwood, as it ever was when he took the high road. I can't take it back. I can't take back anything that I've given you, or anything that I've said. In Arlathan, this ring. Good. See? It means something to you that has nothing to do with me. Keep it. I'd rather it not be lost when I stepped back, my eyes dropping down to my bare stomach where the bandaging had been cut away. It was smeared in still damp blood with stitches crisscrossed over mottled purple skin. Gods! I really was on borrowed time. I looked up when a tendril of healing magic sank into my bones. What do you think I have been researching all this time? I will find a way to keep you safe, Rial. The orb will not claim you as the well did Morrigan. I gave him a weak laugh. It was true if only because he was too damned responsible to let some ancient being take possession of the anchor. She's not dead, Salas. She might as well be. Her free will died the moment she gave herself into the service of an ancient Elvean god, he shouted, and I fell back a pace in shock. He was livid, his ears all but flattened back like an angry dog. You don't even believe in the creators. I don't believe they were gods, no, but I believe that they existed. Something existed to start the legends. If not gods, then mages, or spirits, or something we've never seen. I will not allow you to be bound to one of them. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I tried again. You won't allow it? Who are you to fucking decide? If that's what it takes to stop Corypheus, so be it. I was raised to serve the gods. Not all of them, he countered, ever the expert at using my own beliefs against me. I mopped a hand across my forehead. Creators, fuck. Fenen knew it, Joven knew it, Salas knew it. I was the only one still pretending that there was still some outside chance that. At least that would mean it's finally over. And what if it's not? What if it is not your death that's required, but your life? Corypheus told you the anchor was permanent. What if this so-called god requires you for some purpose? I'd rather serve a god of the people than suffocate in Androsta's shadow. Would you join Andruil on the hunt, serve as her hound, kill innocents for sport? Would you raise entire villages to satisfy Phalandin, sow destruction for Elgarnan, pour your magic into Silas's fire, smother children to preserve the secrets of Dirthaman? They're locked away. Powerless. The orb doesn't belong to them. My point remains, he said, calming his temper at last. You know nothing of what a god might ask. Do not be so eager to relinquish the power of consent. I wanted to argue, to say it would be an act of worship, but he was right. Even if he was playing me as he'd played Joven, I couldn't deny that kernel of truth. If we'd forgotten slavery in Elveanan, the purpose of Valislan, the madness of the creators, what atrocities had Fenharil committed for his reputation to endure? The betrayer. Dread wolf. Bringer of nightmares. Lord of tricksters. Was he whispering to Corypheus from the shadows in the guise of Dumat, just as Corypheus called to the wardens? I couldn't even say it. The word had lost all meaning. I lowered myself to the faded rug, too tired to pretend I'd prefer a Shemlin bed. I wanted something hard and sturdy beneath me, not the formlessness of shifting feathers. I was so tired of trying find my footing in a make-believe world. I'd spent my entire life pretending that being Dalish somehow made me more than just another fucking knife-ear, that our history was any more credible than a fairy tale, that one day we'd restore what was lost, and I was pretending still that I had any faith left in the creators, that I'd done anything to earn the anchor, that Shemlin history books wouldn't round my ears as easily as Salas erased my Valislan. There would be nothing left of me when it was over because there was nothing to me in the first place. I was exactly what Abelus said, a shadow playing in the woods. I kept pretending that I'd accomplished something for the people in Halam Shirel when I'd done nothing but put another Shemlin emperor on the throne. Shardan's rebellion couldn't even hold the Dales a fraction of the time Abelus spent in Othenera, but I was blithe enough to pretend Briola could reshape Orlais in a few short decades. It was no wonder Salas wanted nothing to do with the elves when I'd crowed my short-sighted victory. I could only imagine how petty he thought me for abandoning the Inquisition just to overthrow the Duke of some insignificant city-state. Without Lady Volan's constant support in the negotiations, the Lords of Wycombe would have labeled it an elven rebellion, a humbling reminder that however well I pretended to play the game, I would always require a human chaperone. Salas, I'm so sorry. You came here to help, and I brought a Dalish shitstorm straight to your door. If we were still, I would never have asked you to lie for me. I know it's all the game, but everything you said? Ma Serenis. Do not thank me. One day, you will look back and wish I said nothing at all. I managed a little huff of amusement. I've been herald long enough to handle a few more people thinking I've gained the favor of a god. I'm only sorry that it forced you to play Shartan to my Androsta. Salas sat down beside me, swiped his forefinger and thumb from the corner of his eyes to the bridge of his nose, refocusing his mana. He reached into the folds of his shirt and produced a vial of lyrium, swallowing the whole thing in a go and wiping the back of one hand across his mouth. Seeing him so exhausted, I couldn't keep pretending he was anything more than a man, or that I was anything more than a child dreaming up an Elvean mystery to replace a truth far more mundane. He'd simply wanted out. I'd let the accolades of the Inquisition stoke my ego to the point of madness if I thought mortality was my only flaw. As if an agnostic hermit wouldn't have 1,000 reasons to chafe beside the most famous elf in Thedas, a Dalish first part and parcel to the sort of superstitious nonsense he'd chosen a life of seclusion to avoid. My heart squeezed into something small and tight. I'd cobbled a relationship out of nothing but loneliness and lust glued together with the unspeakable stress of the Inquisition, but when it all fell apart I'd acted like I was entitled to something more from the man who'd only ever promised it would be kinder in the long run. Here, he said, gathering me into his arms and settling my back against his broad chest. The magic came stronger, bright, and fast from lyrium, and I watched as my body pushed out the stitches it no longer needed. Relaxing into his arms I thought perhaps that's all he'd ever intended to be, the bit of binding that held me together when I was coming apart at the seams. Temporary. Impermanent. Shem. Chapter 82, Salas was a painter. I followed Cullen to the port at dawn, amused with the way dock workers and fishmongers scattered from his path. Armored boots rapped out the measured purpose of his gait, one beat for every 2 made in my bare feet. I'd forgotten how much effort it took to match pace with a human. The sky had just begun to tint in the east, its vibrancy muted to dusty rose by the smoke billowing from morning fires lit by smithies and bakers and chantry sisters alike. It was the last sunrise I'd see in the marches, not the glory of Elgara vaulting up over the Minander, but a simple star whose light dimmed beneath the veil of Shemlan civilization. A part of me wished I'd never come back, that my memories of Lavalan would remain as Aravels in the woods, not Deshanna beneath a garishly painted Vihanadal or my father tossing Silest's herbs into a human kill. It was not a future I'd ever imagined for them. You did the right thing in coming here, said Cullen, perhaps noticing my frown. Marlodumar meant well, but he was criminally negligent in allowing the Cunary to fester. Kirkwall tore itself apart when he died, and we had but one red lyrium monster to contend with. I blinked back my surprise. Cullen hadn't objected to the Inquisition remaining in Wycombe through the emergency election of a city council to replace the Duke, but I hadn't considered any motivation beyond respect for Androsta's herald. Fuck, I hadn't considered any motivation beyond protecting my clan. When things went to shit, elves took the blame, and I couldn't leave until I was certain the humans wouldn't retaliate the moment I turned my back. I didn't often play the game with my advisors, but it wouldn't do to expose my own short-sightedness. If the Venatori secured Wycombe, they would have aimed for some other city-state soon after. Not the chaos of a fallen Orlais, but sufficient to divide our allies. Coryphaeus never takes the same approach twice. For the time being, I think we can rest easy. What you've done here may sweep change across the free marches. We had cause to oust the Duke, but shy of inciting rebellion I don't anticipate it happening elsewhere. Talk to Varric, Inquisitor. His connections in Kirkwall control the alienage and city guard alike, not to mention the Undercity, he added with a grumble. The Viscount's seat has remained empty for years, there will be no love lost should a city council take its place. You sound like Leliana. It's no scheme. Kirkwall was my home for a decade, I know her well. The nobles and merchants are ready to take matters of state into their own hands. Should it prove a success, even Starkhaven might follow. You're joking. Prince Viel has no claim on Kirkwall, but that hasn't stopped months of bloody siege. He'll never relinquish his ancestral home. Did you know, I served alongside Brother Sebastian as part of my duties to the Chantry? He's as devout as Cassandra, seeking only the Maker's will. The crown sits uneasy on his head. If the herald of Androsta herself were to show him a better path. I dropped my gaze to pick my way through the piles of frigid seaweed and steaming fish guts that littered the water-slicked pier, buying a moment of contemplation. From anyone else, it would have smacked of manipulation, but Cullen was a man of faith. It was vanity to think a whispered suggestion here and there might accomplish more than my ancestors achieved in Halam Shirel, yet so much good could be brought to the people with the Shemlin aristocracy dismantled. Especially if it were done without bloody rebellion, if it carried the legitimacy of the Inquisition. We'll have a good deal to discuss on the voyage home, Commander. I am glad to hear it. These things are perhaps mundane compared to preparations for battle against an ancient Magister, but just as vital. Vital. It was hard to think of Deshanna's decision to relocate Lavalin within the walls of Wycombe as vital, and yet I knew it to be so. Her election to city council was unprecedented. My own rise within the Inquisition had been determined by no vote but the anchor. At last the Dalish held a winning hand, yet I couldn't escape a staggering sense of loss. Lavalin would change the face of Wycombe, but it would swallow them whole. To imagine my sisters accepting wages, to serve the city guard, or some Shemlin haggling with Kalin over the price of Hala wool, my keeper healing for coin, they'd still have their Valislin, but what would make them Dalish aside from a continued belief in gods likely no more divine than Corypheus? Squawking seagulls pulled me from my reverie. The commander twisted to glance down over the wisps of fur blown up from his pauldrons, a half-formed smile tugging at the scar across his lip. He fidgeted absently at the pommel of his sword. You truly don't know why I've brought you here. Honestly. It's been nothing but politicking for city council all week. That and sitting through one chantry service after the next. I think Threnides is starting to grow on me. Whether it pleased him to consider the chant falling fertile on my knife ears or that I'd yet to catch wind of his secret, Cullen's smile widened. He gestured out toward a sleek ship sitting low in the water, sails still curled against the yards of each mast. In that case, my Lady Harold, he cleared his throat to adopt a more regal tone. On behalf of King Alistair therein, in thanks for the liberation of Redcliffe Castle, and in gratitude for the mercy bestowed upon the Grey Wardens at Adamant, may I present to you, the Peacekeeper. As if pulled by some compulsion, I walked past Cullen to the end of the pier. My toes curled around the edge of a worn wooden plank as I gaped, completely at a loss for words. This ship itself was magnificent, which should have made praising it a simple matter, but the figurehead was so obviously, undeniably me that my mouth went dry. I'd never seen myself in anything but a mirror. I ran my fingers through the short crop of hair that no longer covered my burning ears, unsettled by the obvious devotion given to its subject. It was worked from sylvan wood, left arm outstretched beneath the bowsprit, palm glowing with a knot of enchanted viridium to match the carefully inlaid Valislin. Even if only in a bit of wood carved by some Shemlin boatright, I was secretly pleased some record of who I was would remain. Salas was a painter, but he'd never painted me. The figure of a Dalish mage was conspicuously absent from the murals of Skyhold. The king does us a great honor. I swallowed. I've never seen such craftsmanship. She's magnificent. The ship. She'll make 20 knots in fair weather, 30 with mages aboard. About the speed of an Araval, though I didn't say so. Human ships were so enormous I always expected them to be exponentially faster. Prior to the Inquisition, I'd set foot on a boat exactly once, a Marcher cargo ships that took me from Wycombe to Amaranthin. It looks something like the vessel that sails from Jader to Valroio. Yes, a clipper ship, but of a newer design. She leans into the wind at top speed, so she's broader across the stern to help with buoyancy. What you're saying is she has a nice aft. Jovan loved an easy target, and Cullen was a lamb. Though he didn't blush as readily as Leliana so often claimed, he'd somehow emerged from life in the barracks as easily flustered as a chantry initiate. By the time he turned around, Jovan was making his way down the pier with eyes fixed firmly on the ship. Yes, the commander acknowledged. Good morning to you, Guard Captain Lavalin. I suspect the title grated on all our ears. I'd killed the old guard captain and a number of his soldiers in our raid on the Duke's estate, but Marchers were a sturdy folk. A healthy respect for the right of conquest made the remaining rank and file surprisingly open to an infusion of Dalish hunters. It took little more than a round of dueling with blunted blades to sort out the new order of things. Not that Cullen was so confident the arrangement would hold that he didn't reassign Lieutenant Chamber Terra to Wycombe as an Inquisition liaison. Commander Cullen. Abellas for the intrusion, but Keeper Istima Ethoriel sent me to deliver a few of the Fen Herald's belongings. Yes, the stewards on board Alra. What was that? A bit of a Dalish humor, I said flatly. Can you spare us a moment, Cullen? Ah, of course. I'll meet you back at the tavern. I've a bit of paperwork to finalize for Roselline's transfer. Thank you, I said, counting the steps until he fell from human earshot. Why do you say shit like that? Joven shrugged. Ignoring what you're afraid of won't make it less real. Says the man who's been ignoring me all week. I have 5 Delenn to look after. It's not camp, I can't let them run amok. Only 2 are yours. That's the shemmest shit I've ever heard. You know what I mean, Yehodas is there too. You could have come. And mock your Vihanan. Joven, gods, I don't know what else to tell you. We fucked. We said the sorts of things people say after. It's just a word. You don't believe that? Heat crept high on my cheeks, inescapable embarrassment at how much I'd once read into a pet name. We called each other many things, but I was no more Tyrda than he was Fenharel, and Vihanan was only an oath among the Dalish. It wasn't serious. He'd die for you, how is that not serious? It is serious, but Salas risked his life to join the Inquisition before we even met. He's given more to the cause than anyone. To you, he said, matter of fact. The Inquisition was nothing but shem politics till you fell from the sky. Why are you so fixated on this? Joven raked his fingers through his hair, looking for all the world like he was ready to tear out a fistful. Sweet gods, why are you not? He trailed off, too much a rogue to carelessly drop a word like Elvain, but the sharp arc of his eyebrow made his point all the same. That could mean everything for our people. Joven was caught up in the same rush of potential I'd seen in Abellas, but far more shrewd. He didn't want dusty tomes, he wanted Elvain blood to flow in Dalish veins. But I'd been as wrong about that as I'd been about everything else. He cares nothing for our people. Yet he loves you. Hey lamb. He walked away, I won't pretend that's love. You sound like Adeline. I let the words blow past, bits of meaningless noise. I'd left everything and everyone I held dear so that Adeline would never have to. She was a barefaced child too young to understand it was duty, not desire, that sent me from the clan. I was shaken at his audacity in suggesting that sacrifice compared anything at all to Salas growing weary of my bed, as if only some conspiracy could explain my failure to hold his heart. Dareth Shirel, ma sa, I said, lacking the strength to argue. I'd poisoned Joven with so many lies it was my own fault that he couldn't taste the truth. Chapter 83, Skyhold. Cullen and I rode out ahead of the party that accompanied us from Jader, speaking in hushed tones as we broke a trail through fresh fallen snow. A raven had come at first light, bringing news that Venatori holdouts had massacred a regiment of Inquisition soldiers in the western approach. What's he getting at? I asked, staring off into the misty morning. Griffinwing Keep is secure, the tunnels beneath Korokavuz are sealed, even the ruins of Adamant have been destroyed. Corypheus could retake the entire approach and gain nothing. A victory is a victory. If he can rally his troops after their loss in the Arbor Wilds while demoralizing our own, Cullen trailed off, sour at the idea. Then again, it may be diversionary. I don't think Leliana's scouts even sleep, but we should ask her to keep an ear to the ground for movement along other fronts. In the meantime, I'd rather station our troops close to home. I'll not let the Venatori thin our forces. Cullen exhaled with a strangled sound in the back of his throat. And allow them to continue hounding our troops. Or exhaust themselves trying. They have no lyrium, we've seen to that. The keep will hold. For how long? Longer than the vents. Griffinwing has no shortage of fresh water. Cresting the final rise along the mountain pass, sharp winds parted the mists and the fortress appeared as suddenly as if it had been conjured from the fade. At first I registered only its impassive facade, as strange and foreboding as the moment Salas first told me its human name, Skyhold. The commander's voice fell away. I was flung back in time as surely as I'd once gone forward, knee-deep in the snow with Salas cool and distant at my side. I'd stood there staring, a cold knot of dread in my stomach. It seemed the most lonely, desolate mass of stone and ice, all hulking turrets and jagged crenellation. The entire Inquisition had hooped and hollered to see it, but I'd felt nothing but disdain. The harsh human shape of it flew against what little I knew of elven ruins, elegant even in their demise, and mocked my own sense of anathera. Among the Dalish, safety meant a canopy of leaves above and twisting roots below, life sheltering life, not clinging to sheer rock. Then the weeks had been rushing past, piling into months, and somehow the place had warmed. I knew the smoothness of every cobblestone beneath my feet, the smell of fresh cut hay in the stables, the sun-gold blaze of a single oak in the bailey. But those were distant memories. The reality before me felt as safe and secure as a tomb. Inside the walls were crumbling, and what should have been a lawn was trampled to muck. The rooms were filled with cobwebs and dust, dingy canvas still covering someone else's long-abandoned life. "It's good to be home," said Cullen, although I missed whatever had come before. "Tell Arla." "Pardon." "I mean, you're quite right," I said quickly, glad for once that Elven was not a language humans ever bothered to learn. Cullen smiled and urged his mare forward, and my heart quickened his pace to match. "I expect Josephine has Sir Morris rolling out the red carpet even as we speak." "What? Why?" He chuckled. "You've been gone for some time, Inquisitor." 8 weeks. I couldn't number the days we'd been together, but I couldn't stop counting the ones we'd spent apart. I'd no wish to measure my life by the length of his absence, but I wasn't certain I'd ever stop marking the days I woke to find myself a stranger, the world around me stranger still. I'd been wrong about everything. About the gods, the elves, and our history, my own dim skin and my traitorous heart. How had I expected Skyhold to remain unchanged? Like everything else I held dear, it was never truly mine. They called me its lady, but if I were to have children no Shemlin court would deed them my keep. My misgivings multiplied as Cullen and I crossed the bridge, and it was all I could do not to trail behind until I lost myself among the chargers. Even before reaching the cool blue shadows beneath the portcullis, the dull roar of the gathered crowd buzzed in my ears, the quiet murmur of servants and chantry sisters layered with the chatter from soldiers and scouts. I hesitated just before the gatehouse, sucking in a breath of mountain air against the same bright burst of panic I'd felt when Cassandra dragged me from the chantry, bound and defenseless, straight into a mob of humans eager to spill my blood. "Nyfir," they'd said. "Maleficar." Noticing my heart had stopped in his tracks, Cullen brought his amaranthine charger up short, one hand atop the hilt of his sword as if there were no trouble that could not be slain. "Is something amiss?" "Everything is fine," I said, smiling to assure him. "Nothing is wrong." His eyes narrowed, and I waved him off with a laugh. "It's fine. Perhaps I should not have let Josephine announce your arrival." "No, don't be silly. I was just thinking about how much paperwork she'll have waiting for me." I slid down from my heart, and Cullen dismounted as well. Whether or not he did so on purpose, when he came to stand before me, I was entirely shielded from the crowd. I always thought of Cullen hunched across the war table or slumped behind his desk, but toe-to-toe he was damnably tall. There was a time it would have unnerved me, but the commander and I had made our peace. I tipped my chin up to meet his gaze, and found him rather grim. I furrowed my brows in a silent question, curious to see him troubled so. "Your presence at Skyhold has been greatly missed, Inquisitor. I trust you and Leliana had the situation well under control." "We certainly kept them busy," he said, squaring his shoulders. "But troops require more than discipline and strength. Without hope, well, despair can rot an army from the inside out. Is that what I'm here for? I can handle a demon of that name, but I can't fight a concept. With all due respect, it's what you do best. No one who witnessed the attack on Haven will forget what you risked that night, or how the bleakness of our survival transformed when your magic lit that ravine. It's not my magic." That was the cold, hard truth of it. My magic had been little more than flash fire and lightning. If I had chosen to join the Inquisition as Salas had, I'd have been thrown out on my ear. I had no special knowledge of the Fade, none of Dorian's technical prowess, Vivian's rigorous training, nor Morrigan's mastery of the arcane. I'd grown, gods, I'd grown, but whatever pride I took in necromancy and the storm, my value lied in the anchor power stolen from a thief. Everything was being stripped away from me bit by bit, and I wouldn't fool myself into thinking the mark was any different. One day its rightful owner would come to claim it, and if Corypheus wasn't dead by then. But Cullen wore an expression that brokered no debate, and so I said no more. He glanced off at some point behind me, squinting against sunlight reflected off the snow. I wasn't born with a sword in my hand, you know. That's the nature of power. No one cares how you got it, only how you wield it, and Maker knows you do a better job than most. I nodded along because there was a crowd behind us and I'd already said too much. Hannah taught me better than to air out my insecurities, and Joven was right, sometimes they needed a show. Though I was the only soul in Thetas that needn't fear a rift, my quiet hours belonged to the memory of a body slung at my feet in Red Cliff, the shadow of a dragon blotting out the sun. When I closed my eyes, I heard Stroud's solemn farewell, felt corpses beneath my feet in the fallow mire. If it was Andraste's chosen that helped our soldiers keep such terrors at bay, I could pretend a little longer. Welcome home. A voice like Orlshion silk purred in my ear. Oh, your hair is darling. Leliana had crept up from behind to throw her arms around me, and I spun to find Cassandra following in her wake, hands on hips and a knowing look in her eye. She never says such things about my hair. Well, you don't have such pretty little ears, Leliana cooed. And look at all this lovely gold. I touched the ear that Adolin had pierced on instinct, then forced it back down to my side. I'd felt naked without my valislin, but without a curtain of hair to hide behind I was all the more exposed. I cleared my throat and extracted myself from Nightingale's embrace, then reached out to clasp the Seeker's arm. It's good to see you, Cassandra. It is good to have you home, Inquisitor, she said, her hand firm at my elbow. Caught between them as I'd been once before, I forced a grin. I wasn't sure which of them would kill me first, if they knew that I'd spent 3 days in a chantry cellar with the abomination who started the war, or that I'd left Joven with 100 sovereigns for any Shemlin mage who happened to know my true name. Where's Dorian, Varric, Cole, Josephine? In the Great Hall. She thought perhaps we shouldn't all come at you at once. Then I suppose I shouldn't keep them waiting. Together we clattered across the grated entryway in our booted feet, Cullen shouting out to announce me to those gathered in the lower ward. Inquisition, your herald returns. My left hand was raised and blazing to greet them, and it was sudden chaos all around, an eruption of cheers and applause, bodies pressing in from every side. Salutes rippled through the crowd and arms reached out, slapping my back and gripping my shoulders to pull me this way and that. Kisses fell uninvited on the tops of my hands, and faces not seen since the arbor wilds were streaked in tears. But I'd come untethered to float somewhere above it all. Someone that surely wasn't me greeted each of them by name, and someone I didn't know whispered blessings to those who tugged at her sleeve. She soothed every anxious look with quiet assurance, and gave thanks for their service. Grinning as she climbed the stairs, she turned to the crowd as her commander had advised, shouting to those assembled that Wycombe had been purged of Venatori, of red lyrium, of corruption and hate. The roar of their approval was deafening, but the part of me that was till me felt nothing at all. It wasn't the crowd that had changed, only the names. Herald, they called me. Inquisitor. They still wanted my blood, they'd just found a different way to ask. Because that would be the price, wouldn't it? To stop an immortal. I'd been the Inquisition's prisoner and their herald, but my only home was on the battlefield, and that was where I'd lay my head. The revelation bloomed in my heart, warm and sharp like embryum. With it came sweet relief. There was no need to wish back the blood that marked my skin, no need to keep scavenging for scraps of a fallen empire and calling it a life. I was an arrow in flight, unfettered and free, there would be no returning to the bow. Chapter 84, Bit by Bit. No sooner had I stepped into the great hall than Josephine's arm was linked through mine, a shimmery puff of golden silk that might as well have been a thread of force magic dragging me from the crowd. But being pulled along was so much easier than forging a path of my own, and so I lengthened my stride. Regretfully, Inquisitor, but we have not a moment to spare. Dignitaries have already begun to gather for the banquet. I glanced over my shoulder and for a split second locked eyes with Varric, his expression reminding me of the moment we first met, a flash of something cynical quickly softened by an all-too-easy smile. He thrust his chin up by the slightest of degrees to acknowledge the Antivan holding my reins, then grimaced apologetically as if resigning me to that fate. Of course. Of course there would be a banquet. Cullen must not have known, else he would have warned me. We shared nothing if not our mutual disdain of formal attire. Not that I could argue her logic. It would take a mountain of Shemlin support to legitimize what happened in Wycombe, and with a 3-week journey from there to Skyhold she'd had all the time in Thedas to orchestrate a soiree. Josephine pushed open the door that led into the stairwell, and a few sleepy crows scattered up from the banister. Their cries echoed through the tower as we stepped through, a familiar sound that sat uneasy in my ears. Birds didn't belong beneath the roof of a keep any more than I did. "I hope that you will forgive me," said Josephine as soon as the door was closed, "but I took the liberty of raising the Free Marches banner in solidarity with Wycombe." "Oh," I said, aware of what remained unspoken. She'd taken down the Dalish sigil. "A temporary gesture, I assure you." I nodded, not trusting my own voice. "Bit by bit. Every little thing." She paused on the stairs, frowning down at her writing tablet. "I wish I might have consulted you first, but action was required. Distasteful though it may be, there are those among the nobility who would paint the Duke as a martyr. We must give no ground for them to disclaim your victory as an elven uprising. Shall I dock my ears? I'm sure Madame de Fer can stem the bleeding." "Inquisitor." I. Instinctively, my hands flew up, palms out and placating. "That was uncalled for, I apologize. It's the necessity of your action that frustrates me, not you, Ambassador. Let Thedas see our support extends to all people of the Free Marches." "Indeed so," she breathed, tucking an errant curl behind one rounded ear. I opened the door to my quarters and motioned for her to enter, following behind so I could repair my crumbling mask. Antoine dumped red lyrium in the human water supply and stuffed his counsel with venatori, yet there were those who would sooner support his treachery than acknowledge the aid of a savage. It was nothing new, nor the battle I'd been called to fight, and railing about it to a human made little sense. Besides, I changed the Inquisition's heraldry often enough. When the Grey Wardens joined our cause, or when Gaspard took the throne, I would have hoisted the Free Marcher flag if only to remind our enemies that we're more than capable of reaching across the waking sea. Josephine crossed the rug to my desk, pouring a thimbleful of brandy for us both. "Make no mistake, the Duke had no short supply of enemies, and tonight we shall count them as friends." I took the slender glass from her outstretched hand, let it clink lightly against her own. "To Wycombe, then." "To Wycombe." A polite smile graced her lips, and together we drank. She'd obviously gone to the trouble of sending up something better than the rotgut I stocked for myself. She collected my empty glass and set it neatly before the mess of dwarven tomes piled on my desk. It was only then that I had a chance to take in my quarters and realize how very little had changed. Someone had come to make the bed and tend the fire, but otherwise it was exactly as I'd left it weeks ago, a tangle of blankets and bottles by the hearth, empty wine glasses set among the candlesticks, and Amalia's skull beside my bed. "I received word that Lord Everest Lemark will be in attendance tonight." "Fairbanks!" I exclaimed, dropping one hand to the totem. "I thought he was still cross." "I fear that may still be the case, best be on your toes." My fingers brushed across bone and gemstone. "When am I expected?" "6 bells, although I would suggest convening the War Council at 5. Leliana will have information essential to forging new friendships." I saw that a gown and slippers had been laid out, and steam pouring from the adjacent room told me a bath had been drawn. 5 bells. I think I can manage. Until then, Inquisitor. Her footsteps scuffled along the marble stairs, and I absently palmed the skull. Drawing off a bit of the mana pooled beneath the Everite and Stormheart, I relished in the low throb of death magic, dissonant and dark. "Oh, and Josephine," I called out before she was gone. "I'd like to have all my books and journals crated up and sent to Wycombe." She hesitated only a heartbeat. "Of course." I rolled onto the bed, tucking my knees to my chest and holding the totem close. The cool press of it warped the veil around me, like a hammock stretched to cradle a dreamer, and I dipped into a trance. There was time enough to meditate and set myself to rights. Something was amiss. Though I could conjure 1,000 ugly memories of my own, demons no longer plagued my sleep. At first I mistook it for transcendence, at last rising above their temptations, but that was naive. There were infinite demons seeking escape from the Fade, and every one of them had given up on me. I could think of only one reason for their sudden disinterest, that I was no longer available. I'd let myself think it lasted but a moment in the chantry cellar, but it was something more. Amalia felt closer than a second skin, deeper than my bones. I could ignore it no longer. We are not as they are. My mana churned up burning bright, but there was nowhere to cast. Only a Templar could strike at what ailed me. Amalia's displeasure roiled across my aura. You called and I answered. You chose and I accepted. Possession is a sickness, but we are well. How many times had I heard the story? That justice once wore a grey warden like a suit of armor, serving the order until the day it simply dropped his corpse on a widow's doorstep, the same day an amaranthin fishmonger claimed to see a warden mage boarding a pirate ship. Varric himself confirmed it to be true, to the world and tale of the champion, then again to Cassandra and the Inquisition. Anders surrendered his life to a spirit, a choice that ended as possession always did. The fault belongs to justice. It holds no dominion in the Fade, but remembers a time when it could shape the world. Lacking the will to manifest as your compassion, it chafed against the veil. Despair drove it from a corpse to nest among the living, and despair drives it still. We are well. She curled around me like a cat, dark and deadly and serene. There was nothing to be afraid of, only comfort and calm. I wondered what sort of spirit Dorian had pulled across the veil, but not even necromancers could speak of such things aloud. I now understood the why of it a little better, if the chantry had any idea. Suddenly, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, hands folded primly in my lap. Rings enchanted for cunning were on each finger, and an amulet of willpower glittered between my breasts. I wore the emerald gown Josephine had laid out, belted with gold at my waist, and satin slippers laced with ribbon. I glanced up sharply. The angle of the sun had shifted, casting tawny light and shadows across the rug. Hours had passed. I flew to my feet and whirled around, lightning crackling against my skin. Amalia's laughter was a purr somewhere deep in my chest. You care not for such things. Now they are done. I swallowed thickly. The memories were there, like a dream I'd forgotten. Discarding my dusty armor and climbing into the tub, letting heat soak away the ache of travel. I'd dressed in a trance, then twisted the short strings of my hair into curls before staining my lips and lifting the stick of coal, human customs I knew nothing of. Yes, go and tell your Templar. Fear. Tremble. A smile tugged at one corner of my mouth. It felt no more a lapse of control than when I surrendered myself to the crowd, let them pull and push me to a place I never meant to go. If Amalia meant to hurt me, she could have done so long ago, and if she intended to leave as Salas always had, then she'd had her chance in Wycombe. Content as she was content, I made my way down the stairs. Chapter 85, Revere. There was precious little to discuss that Lady Volan had not already told me in Wycombe, so what insight Leliana had to offer flew by quickly enough. Judging by the sheer volume of reports and tokens scattered across the table, we'd likely spend the better part of a week sorting through it all, but I'd presumed we'd finished for the night when Cullen stood a little straighter and tugged sharply at the hem of his formal jacket. The commander cleared his throat but once, and I inclined my head. What was the expression Varric taught me? Waiting for the other shoe to drop. My soldiers and I captured Samson, Inquisitor. An easy task, given that he was still unconscious from Muir. Unconscious, I repeated. Lady Vivian tended his wounds. I poured lightning through his veins and put a blade in his heart. Was I unclear in my intent? Silence, then Leliana shrugged. Kill him again, if you like. In her report, Josephine cut in, Madame de Fer wrote that Samson was, and I quote, a prize the Inquisitor may regret not taking the time to savor. I lay my palms flat on the war table, recalling the moment with perfect clarity, Cassandra shouting from the bounds of my static cage while Samson choked and convulsed beneath my feet. I could still feel his blood-slicked breastplate against my solace, and the sudden stillness of his death an instant of satisfaction and pride. Oh, gods, my pride standing across the battlefield with a look of such unguarded adoration that... Give him to Danya. Shall I question him first? Leliana sounded cheerful at the prospect, but Cullen shook his head. A waste of time. Templars are trained body and soul, nothing short of demonic intervention will break him. That, I thought sharply, could be arranged. Pushing at the token set atop the arbor wilds, I schooled the malice from my voice. I'm inclined to agree, if only because Coryphaeus is not the sort of master to teach his pet. Samson had no idea what it meant to drink from the Virabalassin. On that note, Josephine cut in. The Well of Sorrows was constructed in unspeakably ancient times. There may be slivers of information left in elven legends, or crumbling papers in far-flung libraries. Perhaps we should send people to research how ancient elves made this strange artifact. Absolutely. It's my understanding that Keeper Solon in the Korcari Wilds is in possession of many ancient texts that reference the well, including those Morrigan herself has examined. Though the witch had declined attending the war council, I refrained from accusing her of theft in deference to her mother. The tomes had been returned to Arion, after all. Josephine glanced up from her tablet, quill poised just above the paper. Would not the oldest human records on magic be found in Tevinter? I can arrange for our scholars to visit the Minrithus archives. Yes, of course, I demurred. Then let us adjourn. We have kept our guests waiting long enough. Heedless, Josephine gathered up the stack of reports we'd been able to address. Colin followed her from the room, ducking through the inset door that led to the hall. It was not lost on me that Leliana lingered at her post, leaning back against the rough-hewn edge of the table to look out the thin, slatted windows. I will see to it a message reaches Keeper Solon. The sigh was louder than I intended. That obvious. Josie means well, but she has little experience beyond her station. I am grateful she need never walk a path as dangerous as mine, although I do not envy the confines of our ambassador's office. I would not be who I am today if not for the mercy of an elven mage. Nereus Urana. When I was a stranger, she said, at last turning around, you chose the mountain path and my scouts were saved. I was your captor, yet you shed blood with me in Andraste's temple, my sister in arms. I flinched with the memory of a different battle, terror gutting her in a single blow. Lethalin burned on my tongue, but I gave it no air and the flame was snuffed. I'd put my faith in the bloodshed of Redcliffe one too many times before. There are few who would claim me as such. We are all the Maker's children, no. If only his chantry thought the same. If only, she smiled. But come, before Josephine decides we've dallied too long. Leliana proffered her arm and I took it, fingers brushing along the soft velvet of her sleeve. We walked through the drafty corridor, silent but for the distant sounds of those gathered for the banquet. In the dim firelight still burning in Josephine's hearth, she paused to shoot me a sidelong glance. I must travel to Valence, Inquisitor, one final errand for divine Justinia. You have been gone for some time, but I would be glad of your company. I can think of no one I'd rather join. No? Some prefer to travel with a mage at their side, or a powerful warrior. Ah, but only a bard can sing for me. For people like me the elves, the pagans, and the apostates Vivian or Cassandra would seek to convert and confine. However ruthless, Leliana held no such dogma. When I was gone, she would be the most powerful ally I could leave behind. You need only to name the song. And with that, every pretense of the game was stripped away. When I died, no one would call Phaland into my side. Not that it mattered what happened to me, songs were for the living. If the chant of light were sung over my bones, what human would remember that it was a Dalish who saved them? And if that were forgotten, my death would gain nothing for the people. I think I know just the one. Wonderful. Then I will make the arrangements. It is but a day's journey. And so we exited into the great hall, arm in arm. If she meant to rally support in her bid for divine, the gesture would mean a great deal to those watching from the shadows. Vivian included, though I'd no concern for what she thought. Although if Leliana could claim me as a sister in arms, then Cassandra was something closer still. The thought knotted uncomfortably in my chest. In face of the smattering applause that greeted us, Leliana turned suddenly shy, giggling as she leaned to whisper in my ear. The man in the yellow doublet, Phil Liam Trevelyan, who fancies himself a bard. Say nothing you would not have him repeat to the world. Duly noted. Now, she cautioned, pulling me toward the nearest table. I have made a vow not to release you before I see a glass of wine in your hand and a smile on your face. The smile came easily enough, and the wine appeared soon after in the gloved hand of a dwarven rogue. I reached for the glass, hardly recognizing the man in a silken blouse and tailored breeches, golden hair for once loose around his shoulders. We stood appraising each other in silence, a subtle exchange of raised eyebrows asking questions and half-shrugs giving answer, until Leliana slipped away. Now. Who are you again? Varric Tathras. Rogue, storyteller, and occasionally unwelcome party guest. Unwelcome. Ruffles thinks I have half a mind to spring you from this stuffed church shit show. And how's that going down? Beats me, Sparkler's in charge, he said from behind a mug of ale. At the very thought of Dorian, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He was not hypothetical or conditional, but real. A thread of doubt trembled somewhere in the back of my mind, but I snapped it in two. Where is he? Technically, he said, dragging out the word like a question. Not invited. Apparently canoodling with Tevinter mages after kicking Tevinter mages out of Wycombe sends a mixed signal. To the Orlshian nobles I'm saving after Orlshian nobles slaughtered my people. To be honest, I'm not sure they're getting enough oxygen behind those masks. I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks, and traded my empty glass for another. Varric shadowed me through the hall through my initial round of noble chatter, but it was eventually his adoring fans, rather than my own pressing duty, that drove us apart. By the time the feasting began in earnest, I resigned myself to the slow progression of courses that kept me pinned at the table with delegations from Rialto and Bastion on either side. Vivian swooped by to welcome me home, and each of my advisors came to check on me in turn, but for the most part I resigned myself to the endless repetition of the conversation that inevitably continued well after dessert. Yes, there was red lyrium in human drinking supply. No, the elves are not immune. Yes, the Venatori infiltrated the city. No, the Duke was not possessed. Yes, the new city council includes members of my clan. No, I did not use the power of the Inquisition to appoint them. The current city council will remain through Corypheus' defeat, I explained to a pair of nobles from Val Fermine. But after the war new elections will be held, and a more permanent plan of governance enacted. Behind her gilded mask, the woman's eyes were glittering bright. What a charming idea. I managed a wan smile, and then a gentle touch at my elbow provided the excuse of my escape. If you'll pardon me. I swung around, willing to devote my full attention to a chantry clerk if it meant avoiding another minute of that particular line of banality. But instead of any such thing, there stood a slight Navaran man with skin the color of richly brewed tea. Surprise propelled me straight into the warmest Shemlin greeting I knew, and I threw my arms around him. Vyas and Axes, I breathed, utterly stunned to find my mentor returned to Skyhold. Even more stunning, the gesture was returned, and an almost ceremonial kiss laid on each cheek. The mage pulled back a pace, gloved hands still clasped at my elbows, brown eyes warm but solemn. I was saddened to hear that we lost a party of Inquisition soldiers in combat with the Venatori. Ma Serenis. I just received word of it myself. Do you have a moment? He released me with his hands but not his eyes, some urgency belying the usual aloofness of his gaze. I retrieved my own wine from the table and passed a goblet to the necromancer, gesturing toward a vacant seat at the table. Please, sit. I have come to speak for the dead. Oh, I said, at last unraveling his intent. Yes, of course. Vyas followed me from the great hall into the garden, empty but for a few couples availing themselves to the secluded alcoves. In the starlight I saw that someone had tended my herbs with great care, and the small stone phalan that I'd erected yet stood. I led him along the sheltered walkway to the small chapel Mother Giselle had installed. It afforded a greater degree of privacy than any room but my own quarters, where I didn't dare take him with so many gossiping nobles watching. The door groaned as I pushed it open, but inside it was as quiet as a tomb. I pulsed a spark of mana across the veil, and the candles set around the base of Andraste's shrine cast the room in flickering light. There was a single dusty pew pushed up against the wall, and together we sat. I was vaguely aware that my posture was far too human, legs crossed at the knee. There was an air of formality that Vyas held around himself, like a shroud of death itself, his features locked in calm repose. The candlelight exaggerated the dark shadows of a beard that was not permitted to grow, but his scalp was entirely smooth, and my fingertips knew already exactly how stop. As I understand it, he began. The Venatori now pose a significant threat to the western approach. Our soldiers' deaths will not be the last. That is what I hope to avoid. Ravens will be sent tomorrow, instructing our forces to hold. Commander Cullen would prefer us to go on the attack, but the Venatori will expect retaliation, he said dismissively, taking a sip from his wine. But not from those already felled. My heart skipped a beat. It was one thing to force an enemy's corpse into battle, but to raise our own bloody soldiers and send them shambling across the field? Gods, fuck. Josephine would be furious. Most of Thetas considered necromancy no better than blood magic. Yet the Venatori could not possibly stand against the undead. It was certain victory. Vius regarded the conflict as it played out on my features, but his own were utterly placid. No, confident. He knew already that I'd made my decision. I could send a few apprentices to the field, in secret. If we lure the Venatori out, the soldiers' physical bodies may complete the task. Why let the Venatori claim more lives? We need not allow them that. Do it. He nodded once, and the matter was done. Do you find that our way suits you, Inquisitor? The way, yes. The rumors I could live without. I imagine you've heard a few of them by now. We swim always in the rumors. The living are salacious. I'm not judging, Blackwell said, crossing his arms in a way that said, I'm judging. I'd laughed it off at the time, but it was a point he'd always hold against me. I suppose they are, I said, looking down at my wine. One of my closest companions claims I have an unnatural fascination with the dead. Accused me of sleeping with corpses. I take it you do not. Vius. It is not unheard of among our kind. I went perfectly still, looking for any trace that he was joking. Our kind. Is that your preference? Me? No, he said, leaning forward by the slightest of degrees. I vastly prefer a bed that is warm. Chapter 86, Holy Maker. Prefer. Perhaps it was the wine, but for a moment it sounded as if Vius were suggesting the warmth of the living was a preference and not a prerequisite. It was certainly the wine that made me bold enough to ask. Have you ever? It is a complicated subject, he said, reminding me of how Salas once demurred from a similar question. How many answers did I lack for want of courage? I took another sip of wine. You've taught complicated subjects to me before. Vius gave me an appraising look, as he had the first morning we'd met, and stretched one arm out along the back of the pew. He'd once carried himself with a formality that seemed almost tranquil, but there was something less guarded about him now that I had taken my vows. He drank from his goblet the same way Dorian would, breathing in to savor the wine with the practiced ease of a connoisseur. After considering his words, he set the glass aside. Just as it is a sickness to lust for the dead, spirits that desire mortal flesh are inherently corrupt. Such unholy unions invite abomination. The mortality therefore extend occult knowledge only to the sound of mind. In turn, a necromancer calls forth only the sound of spirit. A sense of deep satisfaction settled over me as I recalled what Amalia had told me. We are well. We are well, he echoed with a knowing look. And, thus, able to recognize that circumstance may occasionally allow the Maker's first and second children to forge a bond transcendent of their nature. Love? Between a spirit and a mortal. Such a union is best suited to the Fade, but it is not unheard of for necromancy to build the bridge. Have you ever experienced such a thing? His smile was small and cryptic. Have you? No, I said over a roar like the faraway thunder of a waterfall. The veil prickled along my skin with a memory that didn't belong. Our way is steeped in darkness, Inquisitor. We walk among the dead and dying, and death is in our veins. Until I am called to the Maker's side, it is life I choose to embrace. His eyes briefly drifted down, and for a moment I couldn't fathom what drew his gaze. My Valislin were gone. Then I remembered the amulet, and touched it lightly as I stood. We should return to the banquet, the Orlshians are quick with their rumors. As I understand it, Inquisitor, there are rumors already. Heat flew to my cheeks. Gods damn it. Jovan heard them all the way in the free marches. Of course the rumors had spread to Navarra. Dorian and I had reveled in the scandal, the way my knife ears undercut his father's hope for him to bed a woman. But Vius? He was a speaker for the dead in the grand necropolis, of royal blood. I'm so sorry, Vius. I hope the association has not sullied your reputation. He set his wine glass on the floor and stood. To the contrary, I assure you. The mortalities benefit from having a necromancer acknowledged as the most powerful mage in Thetis. I benefit as well, for King Marcus believes I hold sway with the Inquisition. Well, that's true enough, though it's a shame your proper due is given only as a matter of scandal. His lips twitched with the beginnings of a wry smile. Perhaps the greater shame is that a scandal has not been given its proper due. I froze as surely as if I'd heard a twig snap in the woods. I'd so carefully relegated him within the confines of an arcane advisor that I could hardly reconcile the desire made plain in his gaze. He was terribly handsome, but human, and I'd never thought that. Vius stepped forward with deliberate slowness, allowing me time to object. But I was transfixed by the seductive rhythm of his gait. Unfocused by wine, I was unaware of how close I'd allowed him to come until I was inhaling the warm scent of a human spice I couldn't name. Words failed me. When I looked up, his mouth was near enough to kiss, hovering so close that I could nearly taste the wine that we'd shared. The moment stretched on, as warm and languid as his breath on my lips. Caught in the intensity of whatever boundary we were violating, neither of us moved. He took my wine glass, fingers neatly avoiding my own, and bent to set it on the floor beside me, a gesture at once submissive and invasive, bringing his face all too near. When he stood, I met his gaze, and found myself unable to look away. We'd touched any number of times before, as I trained, when I took my vows, even in the banquet hall mere moments before. But now the thought of it was electric, cling at the hairs on the back of my neck. It wasn't simply an idea, but reality made manifest by magic, tangible between us. What would you have me call you? My heart clenched at the thought. With a title, I could retreat. Oh, but with a name. With a name I invited him to cross a line my clan marked around me long ago. But new lines were being drawn around me, and the old ones washed away. Why should I be bound to the past? I had so little time left in the world. Rial. Rial, he repeated, rolling the R beneath the weight of his accent, and I was helpless to imagine how else that Navarran tongue might roll. Vius reached for me then, sliding one gloved hand around my waist so that his fingertips fit along my spine, and I arced at the touch, an instinct that thrust me against his chest, warm and solid and real. My left hand played with the odd belting at his hip, fearful, testing, was I even brave enough to? I lifted my other hand to his cheek, but I was the one who gasped at the touch, shocked to feel the bite of stubble like sandpaper against my skin. I stroked my thumb along the length of his jaw, at last catching his small, rounded ear in my palm. Oh, gods, he was so human. The hand at my back drifted lower still, but the other Vius brought to his lips, catching the seafoam leather between his teeth to tug it free. He held my gaze as his fingertips traced along my neck, coming to rest beneath my jaw with a gentle pressure to coax out my pulse. Pushing up on tips of my toes, my mouth went to his, warm and wet and impossibly full, a sweet, soft contrast to the sharp scrape of his cheek. He deepened the kiss, and our slowness was broken. Everything seemed to be a jumble of greedy hands and tongue and teeth, and his body was pressing me back until I bumped against the wall. It was a jolt of surprise that stirred up an all too dalish instinct to slip from human hands, an energy I channeled to pin him against the wall instead. He groaned into my mouth with the impact, then bit at my lip until I was gasping. I'd imagined human kisses would be as formal as their customs, but I found him as urgent as any other man. I parted my legs to straddle his thigh, bowed my head to his throat to lick at the roughness of his skin. My heart skipped a beat when his hands settled at the small of my back, loosening the laces of my gown. The banquet was still in full effect, and I'd been herald of Androsta long enough to feel a flash of concern. Should we? I trailed off and glanced at the shrine behind me. Vius didn't even pause. What better place to cry out the Maker's name? My own startled laughter echoed in the empty room. I'd openly denied Androsta at every turn, but there was something deliciously devious about fucking a man in her temple. Or, he continued, pressing his mouth to my neck, "Do you swear by a different god?" The moan was inescapable, desire drawn out by the memory of every blasphemous cry. The anchor sputtered in my palm, but Vyas was unconcerned. There was a cascading shink of metal on stone as my gilded belt slid to the floor, and the gown loosened from my hips to fall down around my ankles. But for the silken slippers laced at my feet, I was naked before him. His eyes were heavy-lidded with lust that sent his hands skimming across my breasts, thumbs teasing at my nipples until they were hard and small. The strangeness of it was a shock of pleasure. Valislan once guided men across my body, drawing every hand along the same swirling paths, but Vyas was without a map. Unable to follow the pattern I could predict, each touch a surprise that left me trembling and gasping for more. Gods, I wanted him despite myself, despite everything I'd ever been taught. The thought of half-formed Dalish dogma holding any sway over my heart drove me to my knees, to fumble with the clasps that fastened his belt, to pull open the laces, to take his thick, Shemlin cock in my hands. Vyas was hard already, skin like silk and blazing hot in my palm. "I've never done this," I said, words tumbling from my mouth before I realized how naive they'd sound. "I mean, of course I've, just not." "Ah. So I need not fear reprisal from Lord Pavis." I bit back a laugh. A victim of the rumor mill. Relieved at his nonchalance, I refocused my attention. There was no mistaking Vyas for an elven man, not with the fine, dark curls that brushed against my lips as slid my tongue around the base of his shaft, but there was no mystery to him either. I licked him from top to bottom, once and then again, until his cock was slick enough to swallow. My tongue flattened beneath him and I suckled until my nose pressed into his soft thatch of hair. His fingertips were light on the backs of my ears, stroking in a way that told me I wasn't the first elf to kneel before him. Yet I moaned around his cock, perversely aroused to think he knew exactly how to handle me. Vyas let me continue to suck a moment more, then pulled himself free. I helped him escape his trousers while he shrugged out of his jacket, then he spread it out across the floor. I went to my hands and knees on the soft leather, glancing over my shoulder to watch as he knelt behind me. I felt a familiar trace of magic as he cast a ward around us, but I cast my own as well, insurance I could not breathe easy without. Then his fingers dipped between my legs to test me, and he swore in Navaran at what he found. He eased into me with a few short strokes, hissing as he finally buried his full length inside. I squirmed against the sudden fullness, spreading my legs a little wider in accommodation. "Holy Maker," he swore, so wonderfully obscene in his abandon that I finally understood why Salas loved to hear it. Gods, he'd loved to hear it. Vyas pulled back until the ridge of his cock caught at my entrance, then dug at my hips to slam me back against him. He went on until sound of it would have made Androsta blush if her complexion weren't set in stone. Vyas slid his hand around to press against my clit, and I braced myself against a methodic rhythm that told me he'd no intent of lingering. "Harder," I demanded, and he was quick to comply. I was painfully aroused at the realization that I was on my hands and knees for a human. Joven would be absolutely shocked, Salas would be furious. Whatever my doubts, I was certain of that. Furious that I'd disrespect a place of human faith, furious that I'd have abandoned my duty at the banquet, furious that I'd let a human fuck the key to his salvation, furious that I'd let a human mage spill his seed inside my elven cunt. Elf takes the elf. Oh, gods, Fenharil, Maker, fuck. I dropped to my elbows, pressing my mouth to my hands to stifle the cry, a quick shock of pleasure that washed over me and ebbed away. Vyas lasted only a few moments longer, grunting and swearing to the Maker as he came. He collapsed over me, heart pounding against my back as we lay there panting in Androsta's shadow. Not in love, but alive. After a time, his breath slowed and he rose up on his knees, leaving me gaping and empty and wet. He rummaged through his clothes with brisk efficiency, offering me a handkerchief so I could tidy up as best I could. When I was done, he burned it to ash, the only true evidence of our coupling all but vanishing into the dusty corners of the chapel. Chapter 87, A Matter of Policy. Vyas must have assumed I had servants to dress me, because the moment I retrieved my gown from the floor, he took it from my hands though he was still shirtless himself. With a sharp snap, he shook out the wrinkles and bunched the skirts against the bodice. He gently caught both of my wrists in his hand to lift my arms, threading my hands through the top, world going dark. The gown went over my head. He pulled the bodice down around my waist, then spun me around. I nearly bounced with the motion as he tugged and tightened each row of ribbon, adjusting, readjusting until the bodice was laced with crushing tightness. Vyas turned me back to face him, then knelt to smooth the material around my hips and legs, brushing away the dust and shaking out the skirt by its hem. We'd been in such a frenzy that I'd scarcely seen him naked at all, leaving me to belatedly admire the man as he crouched before me. Though he lacked the definition Dorian built in combat, Vyas was lean and compact in a way that suggested not all his time was spent casting glyphs and wards. When he stood, I laid a hand across his chest to comb my fingers through his wiry curls, trailing down as it tapered into a dark line that disappeared beneath the band of his trousers. Undistracted from the task at hand, he reached around me to crisscross the gold chain of my belt across my hips. "You're rather good at this," I said, watching as he adjusted the belt's decorative cord to fall just so. "I trust you are not disturbed to realize more of my time is spent dressing women than the reverse." "Oh. The necropolis, gods. Of course. Not in the least." He stepped back to regard his handiwork, and I feigned a huff of indignity when he slid 2 fingers into the top of my bodice to adjust my breasts. "You are an exquisite creature," he said, stroking one thumb across my newfound cleavage. His own wardrobe was more easily set to rights, his stiff leather jacket covering over any disarray underneath. I gathered his gloves from where they'd been discarded, and in a moment Vyas looked as collected as he'd been not 15 minutes before. Together we stepped into the garden, the formal distance we'd kept between us in place once more. No one spared a second glance as we strode along the arcade, nor did I catch any suspicious whispers. Truly, the only thing I could hear was the shrill tone of Morrigan's voice as she took some hapless fool to task. "Your aid is most unwelcome." Sweet Silas, she was imperious. I'd hoped the well of sorrows would have imbued her with a more patient wisdom. In the morning we would speak. Wycombe had delayed me from her mysteries long enough. "I shall send word to my apprentices at once," said Vyas, resuming our previous conversation for the sake of whatever appearances we needed to maintain. "Excellent. I would like to keep their movements as well. Hello, there." As if out of thin air, a little boy stood in our path. He seemed almost sickly, pallid skin and dark circles under his eyes, lank hair combed severely to one side. The aura about him seemed about the same, heavy and sour but unusually intense for anyone so young. Vyas felt it too, his brows pressed low with concern. "You're the Inquisitor," said the boy. "Mother never told me the Inquisitor was an elf." "The ears gave me away, didn't they?" He gave a solemn shake of his head. "No. Your blood is very old, I saw it right away." I smiled despite the oddly hollow tone of his voice, remembering what it was to be a child so full of magic I could scarcely describe the world around me. "Did you? That's very clever. You must be Kieran. I thought you'd be scarier. Mother said you were scary." With a conspiratorial glance from over the top of the boy's head, Vyas cut in. "And who is your mother?" "Mother is the inheritor, she who awaits the next age." The strange mix of childlike pride and prescience settled uncomfortably in my chest, a pang of regret for having abandoned the well of sorrows to his mother. "Oh? Perhaps she's simply waiting for you. Let's go find her." Kieran took my hand of his own accord, set out across the garden. Vyas followed along at my side, watching as the boy traced the dormant lines of magic in my palm. "A curious child," he said. "Wait till you meet his mother. Mother, look. Did you see what's on her hand?" I was so focused on not tripping over my skirts as Kieran all but dragged me up the steps of the gazebo, that I scarcely looked up when he thrust out my arm to show her. So it was with a searing shock of surprise to find Salas standing in the shadows beside Morrigan, regal in the furs and leather of his bat-lemage robe. We'd settled into a comfortable distance on the journey from Wycombe, but with my thighs sticky from, oh, gods, the wrongness of it crushed against my heart. Vihanan. It was only the mask of the game that kept my wits about me so that I could turn to Morrigan with a bemused smile. "Look who I found wandering alone in the garden." "Unhand the Lady Inquisitor, Kieran," said Morrigan, her irritation melting into something soft and fond. "Did I not already bid you sweet slumber in the fade?" The boy looked between me and Salas, then back to his mother. "But 'Tis not a debate, little man. Kieran released me with obvious reluctance, and I let my outstretched hand turn into a flourish of introduction, at once deeply grateful for the sterile confines of courtly grace. Lady Morrigan, allow me to present Speaker Vyas Anaxas, of the Mortality. Morrigan is one of my principal advisers in matters of the occult. Vyas dropped into a bow befitting a lady of so vague a station, and the witch offered her hand. An elusive sect, she intoned. Only in that our duty affords little opportunity for travel. How fortunate then that circumstance should bring you hence. The greater fortune is in discovering so many fellow scholars of the arcane, he said, nodding to Salas, who returned the gesture with icy aplomb. A few too many, 't would seem. I had hoped she'd have made her peace with Salas after his advice earned her the well, but evidently she still held him in low esteem. Is there something amiss? Indeed there is, for I was assured upon joining the Inquisition that I would answer to none but yourself. That assurance remains. She turned to give Salas a sly smile, then pray inform this meddlesome fool that any examination of the, she paused to consider Vyas, artifact shall occur at my sole discretion. I didn't need to know the particulars of their quarrel. Each was fiercely determined to be the sole arbiter of elven magic and lore. Now the balance of power had shifted, and though no doubt she meant to remind him, it was beyond childish to do so with so many curious eyes and ears open all around. I would be more than happy to address your concerns in the morning, Lady Morrigan, but for now I have a banquet to attend. Salas politely inclined his head. No doubt many urgent affairs require your attention. Irrational guilt churned at my stomach, shame flushing high across my neck. He couldn't possibly know. He couldn't possibly mean to suggest. My paranoia was smothered by Morrigan's pique. Am I to believe the mighty herald of Andraste stands powerless to forfend such intrusions? No more than you. Ward the door if you like, but if your skills are insufficient to the task I'll have Commander Cullen station guards at the door. She seethed at the notion but withdrew, and I looked to Salas, disbelieving that he required an explanation of anything so fundamental as the respect of private property. But instead of the quiet scholar he presented to the world, his eyes were narrow above a half-formed snarl. I should think that you of all people would not suffer a human mage to lay claim on elven treasure. Was that not your very recommendation in the Arbor Wilds? That, he snapped, was for your protection. Had I known you'd make it a matter of policy, he ground himself to a halt, clenching his jaw. By your leave, Inquisitor. As he stalked out across the garden, the space between each heartbeat seemed to stretch toward infinity. I hadn't seen his composure so frayed since the day we'd brought Tom Rainier back to Skyhold in chains, when he was one hard push from. No. Gods, no, it was a sickness that my heart sang to imagine he might feel anything at all. Chapter 88, Truth is not the end. It wasn't the crossroads, and I wasn't dreaming. The weight of realization pressed down against my chest, until there was no room to draw another breath, no space for my heart to beat. The world spasmed sideways and out, groaning like a ship that strained against the storm. I blinked back to clear my vision, but the sickly green remained. Oh, gods, please, no. A tattered scrap of flotsam drifted past, and I followed it up and up and up until I was looking at the fade-touched clouds. I staggered away from the Eluvian, turning a slow circle in search of the only landmark I knew and finding nothing in its place. Just tendrils of emerald fog parting to reveal streaks of clear blue sky. Dread pushed me forward, as if a few extra steps from the wall might suddenly reveal an entire city hidden from my view, but there was nothing behind me save the memory of the breach. The Black City wasn't gone, it was the ground beneath my heels and the dust between my toes. I managed a shaky breath, and the magic that hung heavy in the air condensed around me as if I were a glass of cold water. Ramana beaded up on my skin, streamed from my tunic in rivulets, pooled in the palm of my hand to form a spectral staff. Amalia uncurled herself from the place where she slept tight beneath my ribs, stretching until she inhabited every inch of my skin. We were too fat with power to be afraid, but the both of us stirred with nervous energy. We'd been lured to this place for a purpose. All around, broken turrets and towers teetered out at odd angles, opening to admit stairs that led to nowhere, windows that looked out on nothing. Straight ahead, the statue of a robed man pointed west. Crossing under his shadow, we found Andraste's head divorced from her shoulders, half buried in the dirt and crowned with moss. Her sightless eyes gazed out on the dead hand, downturned to dangle a pair of skeletal soldiers like puppets from a string. They twisted in their nooses, booted feet pirouetting just above a dinner table emblazoned with the coon. 6 place settings were laid out at the table, but only 4 glasses of wine accompanied the macabre feast: 2 human skulls, a boar's head, a goat's head, a red-skinned fish, and a half-eaten pie. I turned and let the fade carry me away, down a corridor that fed into a flight of rough-hewn stairs. A glint of silverite caught my eye, and I bent to find a small ring hidden beneath a glowing spike of everite. It surged with elemental magic in the palm of my hand, whispered with the promise of lightning to come. I slipped it onto the bare finger that used to belong to Fenharel. Danya would have a field day if I made it home alive. There was no way forward but down, so I followed the stairs until the stone opened up into something like a great hall or cathedral. It was empty but for a strange iron throne and the statue of a headless man, arms outstretched to hold a severed rim's head aloft. If Morrigan had come this way, she was already gone. There was no place for a small boy to hide. A second flight of stairs led me deeper still, to a corridor flanked by the claws of Dumat. The fade grew darker with my descent, and in the flickering veil firelight I saw a flash of pale skin and aubergine silk. Morrigan. The figure paused and turned to shout. Go back. I must find Kieran before it's too late. I summoned a barrier and broke into a run, as fearful that I could lose her as I was fearful of a trap. How easily a demon could take her skin, let me think I'd reached my goal. But not even a demon would be clever enough to ignore me, which was exactly what Morrigan had done, turning away to mutter almost incoherently to herself. Why would Kieran do this? How could he do this? We stand in the fade. To direct the Eluvian here would require immense power. If he is lost to me now after all I have sacrificed. I darted ahead to interrupt. We'll find him, Morrigan, he can't be far. The fade is infinite, she snapped, pushing past. He could literally be anywhere. The fade is a place of purpose. We need only focus. Whatever happens to him now 'tis my doing, I set him on this path. Please help me look, Inquisitor, just a little longer. As long as it takes. I swear it. If Morrigan doubted my intent, she showed no sign, only a brief glimmer of gratitude in her strangely luminous eyes. We fell into a comfortable lope, her long human legs easily matching my stride, and together trekked deeper into the twisted landscape. Eventually, we came to a circular dais where red lyrium erupted from every angle, its corruption shimmering in the air like a mirage. In the center stood a wicked scepter, or an obelisk of razor, engulfed in red lyrium. Even the towers above seemed to bend toward its song. Strange specters rose up to meet us, flying out as if to guide our path. We ran on, following them past a quiet library, past monuments of skull and bone, resigning secrets that lay buried throughout the ages to wait ages more. We did not even stop at the foot of a staircase flanked by winged guardians clad in silverite, and though we took the stairs 2 at a time, we soon lost sight of our guides. At the top of the stairs, the fade burst open into some sort of ritual chamber, and I came skidding to a halt. Blood. There was blood everywhere. Not an imitation or a memory conjured from the ether, but real. It poured out from the hooded eyes of the watcher bowed in defeat, crimson waterfalls bathing an altar of bones, and writhing out across the floor in the shape of a snake eating its tail. The blood song itched along my skin, power ripe for the taking, but wrong. Desperately wrong. There he is, said Morrigan, fingers clammy on my arm, and for the first time I noticed anything other than blood. Kieran stood in the center of the rune, some unfamiliar magic pouring from him in waves, crashing over a woman knelt at his feet. Her hair was like moonlight on snow, and bound into thick horns beneath an Andras Tien crown. Creators, almighty. Who's that with him? No. It can't be. Morrigan leapt forward, practically flying toward her son, and I barely caught up to her in time to see the childlike exuberance that spread over Kieran's face when he saw her. He dropped his hand, snuffing out whatever pale blue wisp he had called Mother. But Morrigan stood as still as stone, and her voice was even colder still. Mother. Now, isn't this a surprise, said the woman, rising to her feet with a sly smile. My heart stuttered, Ashabelinar. Human. Undeniably human. It was Amalia that locked my knee from bowing, Amalia who kept my voice careless and light. So this is all some kind of family reunion. Ashabelinar laughed, genuine mirth crinkling the corners of her eyes and folding the skin at her mouth. She affectionately draped one arm across Kieran's shoulders, but turned her cat's eyes on me. Mother, daughter, grandson, it rather warms the heart, does it not? Something about her expression pulled me in, as if some unspoken detail made me part of the family and part of the joke, but Morrigan was not warmed in the least. She stalked right up to the edge of the blood rune, nearly shaking with rage. Kieran is not your grandson. Let him go. As if I were holding the boy hostage, her mother replied before dipping her chin to address Kieran alone. She's always been ungrateful, you see. Ungrateful, Morrigan exclaimed. I know how you plan to extend your life, wicked crone. You will not have me and you will not have my son. Morrigan pulled at the Ramana all around, threading power between her fingers and coiling it up her arms. Magic sprang to my fingers as well, though I planned only to cast barriers around them both. I'd not tolerate violence against Ashabelinar, nor could I allow harm to befall an heir to the Virabalasin. But my concern was premature, and Ashabelinar more than capable of her own defense. That's quite enough, she said. You'll endanger the boy. The entire Fade trembled as a pulse of cool blue light flared in her amber eyes. Oh, gods, I'd seen that crackling light before a spirit lived within her, and it was that spirit, not the human, who negated Morrigan's magic from the inside out. The witch stumbled forward, eyes wild. What have you done to me? I have done nothing. You drank from the well of your own volition. Time seemed to stop as the implication took hold, and 10,000 alternate explanations vied to take its place. It was Morrigan who found the strength to speak the blasphemy first. You are Mythal. You can't be Mythal, I said without conviction. That's not possible. Explain to me, dear girl, why I cannot be what I am. She was power incarnate, and possessed to be sure, but the All-Mother would not abandon us to live among the humans. To be a human. To raise a human daughter. To leave us with nothing, less than nothing, and walk hidden through our midst, raised from the dead by a Dalish pariah. Mythal was an elven god, you're human, she finished, thoroughly amused. Not a word many have used for me in a very long time. You can't expect us to believe that. I was fighting on principle even while the world crumbled all around. Ashabelinar turned to her daughter with a sort of smug delight. You hear the voices of the well, girl. What do they say? Morrigan shook her head in defeat. They say you speak the truth. Oh, gods. Creators, mercy. You carry Mythal inside you. She is a part of me, no more separate than your heart from your chest, said the goddess, looking through me to Amalia, daring us deny the dichotomy. But what was Mythal? A legend given name and called a god, or something more. Truth is not the end, but a beginning. Her words cut to the heart of me, to the truth I didn't dare tell my clan, and the truth unfolding before me now. I felt her magic against my skin, but it wasn't a caress. She was a whetstone, grinding away the dogma that dulled me. I would forever regret not submitting to her will in the Arbor Wilds, but I was forgiven. I would be her sword. Chapter 89, When He Rises. The five of us tore out of the war room, and it might as well have been a mind blast that threw the whole of Skyhold from our path. The great hall thrummed with tension, courtiers scrambling in useless panic while couriers swarmed anxiously to our side. Leliana's voice was ice behind me, cold commands that turned her scouts from fear to action, while Josephine's was warm and soothing to herd the nobles downstairs. Their startled screams rose up as Morrigan erupted into a cloud of wasps, but I was moving too fast to care, hot on Cullen's heels as he shouldered past the rotunda door. The crack of stone on steel announced our arrival, and a sharp Tevinter swear from Dorian answered in return. Salas spun at the intrusion, dodging back to avoid the commander's charge toward the exit on the outer wall. Blackwell's with me, I shouted after him, even as I reached for Salas with my anchored hand. It wasn't a thing that required explanation. The mark was bleeding out magic I couldn't contain. He didn't need to see the sky to know the breach had been reopened. In the absolute urgency of the moment, we had time only for instinct. He snatched up my outstretched hand, threading it under his arm as he turned, pulling me against his back in a once familiar pose. How many hours had I held him like that, letting Salas study the anchor while I thumbed circles down his spine. But this was field surgery, not some leisurely examination, and I grit my teeth when his magic plunged roughly into the anchor. He twisted up something inside, a knot to stop the thread unspooling within. It wasn't pain exactly, but my vision went white, and I couldn't stop myself from letting my other hand fall to his hip, setting fingertips against bone. He cupped both hands around the anchor, and sank his own mana into the mark. Not a kiss but an infusion, borrowed strength because we'd never learned how to feed the anchor with lyrium. It seemed to draw from the orb alone, and it was only thanks to his studies of the rift that Salas had found a way to bolster it with energy drawn from the Fade. Try it now. My fingers twitched against the roiling magic, and at last I closed the anchor. It will not hold, he said with no small measure of urgency. We must recover the orb. There was so much kindness in the false hope he infused in the word. We. No, there would be no recovering from what was to come. But I looked up at him and nodded just the same. He didn't need to know that I didn't believe. Just as I stepped back to turn toward the door, Dorian burst out from the stairwell, fully armored with a flaming staff in hand. It just so happens that I was about to take a stroll. Care to join me? Remarkable weather we're having. His eyes were narrowed in sly amusement, and I beamed up at my handsome Tevinter, hoping he would remember this and not what was to come, when I'd order him to stay at Cassandra's side. If the Imperium were to ever recover from Corypheus' legacy, it would need him alive. The Seeker too, lest the truth of tranquility die with her, and the Order resume its corruption. 10 minutes, Shemlin. Scramble everyone to the stables. I nearly collided with Varric when I whirled for the door, another man who'd not forgive being left behind. This was a battle he'd fought before, one he intended to finish, but not the one I needed him to fight. I caught him by the collar as I ran out into the great hall. We bolted past whatever stragglers still milled about, fanning themselves and taking vapors, poncy human lords who didn't remember Haven, didn't think their lives could possibly be in danger. Gods protect them if I failed. Varric pounded up the stairs behind me, but in other ways he was 2 steps ahead. The words, "protect the women and children," come out of that mouth, and so help me. No, by all means protect the menfolk too. Ha! As if Bianca'd let me sit on my ass when we could be ripping Corypheus a new one. By the time I hit the marble stairs, I was already half out of my tunic. I know you want to be there, but if you die, the story dies. Ain't that some romantic shit? Varric made a show of warming his hands by the fire while I shucked off the rest of my clothes, gave myself over to the familiar routine of my armor. A keeper's armor, because I would have them remember that I was Dalish. If I was ever your friend, do for me what you did for Hawk. Now, look, don't get all Grey Warden on me here. I pressed my lips together and blew out a dismissive sound. Of course I'll be fine. But if you're dead, who's going to remind the world that an elven apostate with the power of a god isn't a threat waiting to be neutralized? Besides, imagine the royalties. Help me with these. He dashed over and knelt to fasten the buckles on my greaves. I just couldn't resist tracking those Carta fuckers down. Oh, hey, look, a blood magic prison, sounds like fun. I'll just let my best friend cut herself open, what could possibly go wrong? Don't flatter yourself. He would have escaped one way or the other. I shrugged on my pauldrons, lacing their ties through the loops of my light leather breastplate. Yeah? And would he have found all that red lyrium if I hadn't dug up that tag? I might as well have handed him the blighted key. This one's on me. It's not. Anyone can kill Corypheus now, Morrigan knows his secret, but you're the only one I trust to get a message to my keeper. He yanked the last strap tight enough to pinch. So I'm your errand boy now. I can't send a human to the Dalish and you know it. I grabbed my staff from its place on the wall, swung it around in a broad arc to snap my mana into focus. Tell her everything you saw on Sundermount with Merrill, and that I met Ashabelinar in the raw fade. Wait, when did? Satisfied that it was as balanced as time could afford, I let it catch on the holster across my back. Tell her Ashabelinar and Flemeth are one and the same, possessed by Mythal. Tell Deshanna that she intends to avenge the great betrayal, her reckoning is at hand. Shit, he said, drawing out the word while I jogged over to my desk, grabbing a letter I'd written on the voyage from Wycombe, then flying back down the stairs. If she believes you, and that's a big if, give her this. If she doesn't, go back to Kirkwall and give it to Meryl. She'll know what to do. Really don't like the sound of Daisy as anyone's fallback plan. Good kid, but... I paused at the door and turned to face him, hoping he was in a place to listen. If I'm not here to beat sense into you later, remember this, it wasn't Corypheus or Red Lyrium that tore open the sky, yeah? It was the orb. It's nothing to do with you. Varric narrowed his eyes as if I were bluffing him in wicked grace, then shook his head. He was angry, but resigned. Maybe someday he'd even believe me. Yeah, well, my editor's been hounding me to go on a book tour through the marches. Might as well hit up Wycombe while I'm at it. I ruffled one hand through his chest hair for luck, then swung open the door. Colin met us in the Great Hall, bringing me up to speed as we ran to the stables. Cassandra had taken a small party of scouts on ahead with Iron Bull and the Chargers, while Fiona led the rebel mages in warding Skyhold, reinforcing the Vale should it need to withstand an attack. The bailey was totally silent, eerie beneath the breach. No sparring in the practice yards, no hammering from the forge. Everyone had taken up their post or refuge, and even the tavern was dark. Colin and I jogged down the stairs to the lower ward, empty but for Master Dennett, who led Colin's charger and Chardon out to meet us. All right, Inquisition. Up you go. Sent your boys and girls on across the bridge. Horses can't hardly stand still under a sky like that. I thanked him as the commander and I rode out to meet our party, such as it was. I felt like I should say something, offer some last piece of encouragement or hope, but they'd known me from the start. I was the only one among them who hadn't joined by choice, and I'd not insult their sacrifice by pretending to be anything other than what I was. Now, there was nothing to do but ride. We galloped out along the snowy pass, where the moon hung so low the whole valley shimmered with its light. I thought only of Chardon's rhythm beneath me, of the road ahead, of what must be done. So young and vibrant. You do the people proud and have come far. As for me, I have had many names. Compassion was a ghost beside me, light in his saddle as we galloped along the mountain pass. At last I truly understood how expertly he could pick and choose so that what was held in secret could be public and private all at once. She wanted you to know she was a woman. I sank into my heels and blinked back tears, still awed that the All-Mother had revealed herself to me at all, much less while choosing to stand on common ground. When he rises, she wants you to remember that he is just a man. It was peace, then, that washed over me. The whole world was betrayed, but Mythil would lie silent no more. When she brought about her reckoning, the heavens would shake because I was the one who made them whole. I would not fail her in that. Chardon surged forward with my swell of pride, prompting Blackwall and Vivian to race ahead, drawing swords of steel and spirit as the first of the demon horde drew near. As we thundered through their midst, Salas cast a barrier that kept venomous claws from cutting the legs out from under our mounts, while Dorian dispelled whatever miasma came seeping from their ranks. I'd never ridden into battle, but Chardon showed no fear. He leapt over demonic corpses as easily as fallen trees, reared up to trample rage demons as if they were common wolves. I tightened my thighs around him and whispered Amalia's name. She rolled out with my exhale, a specter of death that consumed lesser demons in stride. I glimpsed a blush of red lyrium at the base of the mountain, there was no mistaking the distant clash of steel. All around, huge chunks of the fallen temple were hefting themselves into the sky, and then I saw him in the distance. Corypheus. Orb in hand. At that moment a blast of blood-red light ripped through Salas' barrier, and all of us were thrown back. It was only a burst of focus that let me slip from the stirrups and spring from Chardon's back. He was screaming in pain as I landed, a wild sound like I'd never heard, and then silent. When I turned, Compassion was standing over him with blades drawn and bloody, Blackwall climbing to his feet just behind. I nodded at the knowing look he gave me, acknowledgement of a bargain struck long ago. The veil rippled between one heartbeat and the next, then Salas appeared at my side that much had never been in question. Our eyes met and I was reminded of that night at the Vale fire torch when he'd been so confident and proud. We'd been building toward this, ever toward this, even if I'd been distracted along the way. I offered him a tight-lipped smile. The four of us cut through the tangle of shrieks and shades, deliberately leaving the others behind. Together we broke closer to the fore, where the field reeked of ichor and red lyrium saying. They would not remember Cole, but Thetas would know it was elven mages who saved them and that Tom Rainier had paid his due. Cassandra caught sight of us and struck down a terror that sprang into our path, but it was Scout Harding of all people that fell into step behind me. Not that I think you need them, she said, clipping what could only be a pouch of restoratives to my belt. There wasn't even time for me to whisper my thanks as a booming voice filled the night air. I knew you would come. From the steps of what was once the main entrance to the temple, Coryphaeus bent his massive frame into an ironic bow. I gathered mana into my staff and lightning cracked, testing at his defenses. It ends here, Coryphaeus. And so it shall. Like the conductor he claimed to be, he slowly drew both hands into the air. There was a sound like thunder as rock and earth were torn in two. The bottom of my stomach dropped out, the whole temple was being lifted in his grasp and hurtled toward the breach. Holy creators! I'd not even begun to fathom the power of the orb, or how small a sliver of its strength I possessed. I staggered forward, swaying with the speed of our ascent. Coryphaeus fixed his eyes on mine, and there was no need for me to look away, he was just a man. Chapter 90, Her Faith is Hard Won. The moon was wreathed in clouds of jagged earth and stone. I'd seen it before, in a ruined courtyard where the breach was the sky's only sun. The same thing was happening again, happening now, recreating a world in the shape of my nightmare. Everything was fading green and gray, but for eyes glowing red in the corner of a darkened cell. This world is an abomination, it must never come to pass. I slammed my stave into the ground while the ruins continued to rumble and sway, determined that this would not be that world. There was a man still dead at my feet in Red Cliff, and I would see that debt repaid. Coryphaeus all but sauntered across what was once the vestibule of the temple and swept his arms out wide. I tensed for an attack, but he simply met my gaze and splayed his palms in a courtly gesture. You have been most successful in foiling my plans. Something magnanimous rang in his voice, an echo of the priest he must have been. Back before he claimed to be a god and simply served one. But then it turned to drip with disdain. Let us not forget what you are. A thief, in the wrong place at the wrong time. An interloper. A gnat. We shall prove here, once and for all, which of us is worthy of godhood. I smiled because it was true, and because he was each of those things and yet even less. I'd met the All-Mother and basked in her pride. I stepped forward so that he could see the truth of my claim before I even spoke it. I champion a living god. Coryphaeus glared in open hate, and a scoffing noise scraped along the back of his throat as his dragon hefted itself onto the crenellations behind him. Bits of masonry crumbled beneath the sheer weight of it, and a guttural purr reverberated through the ruins. If Coryphaeus expected me to tremble as I had in Haven, he would be sorely disappointed. Even as its muscles bunched to lunge, his dragon was mere prey for the daughter of Mythal. A slash of emerald lanced through the fade-touched sky, slamming into the other dragon with enough force to ruffle the short fringe of hair at my brow. In a furious tangle of wings and claws, they somersaulted once, then twice before colliding against the tower wall, tumbling over the edge in a shower of dirt and debris. Coryphaeus snapped to attention, twisted face twisting deeper in scorn. You dare. He saturated the air with ancient magic that throbbed against my palm. Salas shuddered against it, but I felt only the calm of a gathering storm. The time for posturing was over. I caught Blackwell's eye and he charged, shield raised and glinting while Salas and I fell back, staggering ourselves closely enough to share a barrier without tangling our spells. We moved as one, a song I'd nearly forgotten, lightning and ice drawn across the veil. A dragon, how clever, Coryphaeus shouted. But it will avail you nothing. You will fall as a warning to those who oppose my divine will. A static charge welled up in my palm and burst through my stave, raw electricity bounding around Coryphaeus like a cage. Arctic winds whipped through the ruins, and snow piled at his feet. The Magi sneered, unimpressed, unaware of a knife in the shadows. He howled and lunged when Cole struck, but my lightning snapped him back to center, to where Blackwell crouched with his sword. Steel clanged against lyrium, sparking sickly red. It was as perfect a first volley as we could have hoped for, but something was wrong. Very wrong. While Salas called out Frost, I broke away to scout the terrain. Skirting along the border of our island, I tuned out the sounds of battle to peer out as far over the edge as I dared. Curls of smoke and burning ember dotted the frost backs below, but I saw nothing on the platforms above. No legion of Red Templars, or cloistered Venatori, not even a handful of Grey Warden thralls. We were alone, utterly alone. My magic stretched out across the veil, searching for hidden rifts or mages but sensing none. And that's when it hit me he didn't intend to survive. Corypheus meant to die with us when the ruins fell, let his soul respawn in the deep roads, strike again when I was gone. Oh, gods! He could still win. If I died before the breach was closed, the future I saw in Redcliffe would still unfold. But if I could, recovering the orb, and with it power enough to seal the breach, was all that mattered. Everything else was something anyone else could do. I whirled around just as the veil buckled and thrummed, flashing to blue as Salas caught me by the elbow, the same sick realization in his stormy eyes. The orb. We have to draw out the battle, give Morrigan more time. How far could you step through the fade if? Not far enough. He required no further explanation, whipping his staff along the invisible path of a figure eight, across the terrace an eruption of ice rooted Corypheus toward higher ground. Blackwell roared at the outrage as we ran, throwing his weight against the wall to send a spray of chipped ice in the air to greet us. He spun, flushed beneath his helmet. I bloody well had him. Therein lies the problem. We cannot land a killing blow until, I stopped short, unwilling to even speak the words lest some foul wisp carry them away. Until. His eyes flickered to the breach then down to me, and I was forced to reconsider. It had only been the glow of red lyrium Tom Raynor had yet to break a sweat. Could do this all day. You may have to, the witch is new to her form. Have faith. She's the child of an elven god. Not until I'd jumped across the chasm that split the stairs did I realize my slip, but there was no time to explain. I bounded up the stairs two at a time, bursting onto the terrace where Corypheus perched upon the highest ledge. Blackwell barreled past, spewing profanities to lure him down, but the Magi Stir paid him no mind. Your dragon is persistent, he called out to me. I will tear it from the skies. The veil sagged with the weight of his poisoned magic, and a snap decision sent me darting out into the open when the dragons thundered past. Electricity flared from my stave, bolting near enough to singe his feathered pauldrons. Let him think me a poorly trained ratus. You dare to touch the avatar of divinity. I flicked one hand into a gesture Jovan taught me long ago, then cast another tepid bolt. He narrowed his eyes at the indignity, and heat sprang into the stone beneath my feet. Blighted lyrium burst up in jagged crystals, throwing me down hands and knees in the rubble. Gods, it would stoke his ego to see a broken bow. A trickle of blood sang up along the back of my calf, and I stood as if pained by a simple cut. I made a sloppy attempt to avoid twin beams of blighted magic, then let the blinding red light engulf me. The onslaught pulsed across the veil, dissonant and dark. Divine. I drew a deep breath, waiting for the worst of it to pass, then let my barrier dissolve. Searing brightness drove me back to my knees, and I fought the Dalish instinct to lock my jaw. Oh, for this human, I would scream. The sound of it was unrecognizable, breaking the focus that lifted me above the pain. I thrashed, no longer pretending but lost. Creators, gods, fuck. Burning, bone-breaking pressure, inescapable, unendurable, something raw in my gut. If you desire death, you shall have it. Something shifted higher, hotter, sharper, and I tasted stone. Rubble scraped my teeth, and I was choking on dirt, coughing up blood, arching up to vomit out thick, violet smoke. I fisted up rock while Amalia streamed from my mouth in steady heaves, forced out of hiding. Enraged. There was no nightmare that could strangle him, no death on which to feed. A fresh barrier snapped up around me just as clammy fingers pushed into my mouth. Then it was smooth glass against my lips, bitterness down my throat, soothing light and strength. I scrabbled at his neck, hauled myself forward to flee, guided by faith and momentum alone. When my vision cleared, compassion was easing me down against a marble column, pressing an open vial into my palm. I panted around it for a moment before tilting my head to drink, and in the cold light of the breach above, I saw two dragons sailed across the sky. You made him forget. I sniffed back a trickle of blood, too winded to laugh. Arrogance would consume him. Cole's hat cocked to the side as he turned, revealing the pale pink curve of a frown. You should not do that again. Behind us, icy winds howled over the sound of clashing steel. I turned to glimpse where Blackwell drew Corypheus along in a dance of half-hearted blows, lunging and feinting but never touching, an all-too perfect waste of time. Morrigan was nowhere to be seen, safe for now from the Magister's wrath. How is she? Flying, feral, ferocious. She thinks that Neria lied. My mind stuttered past the words to her determination in his voice. It was enough. It would have to be enough. The air grew still, and we hurried out to rejoin the others beneath a wide arch at the foot of a tower thrown off its foundation by red lyrium. Blackwell nodded at our arrival, looking inexplicably smug. That took stones. Thanks for making it count. I tagged his arm as I jogged past, hitting the stairs at a run. We pursued Corypheus through the ruins, racing ever up. At each landing we glimpsed demons streaking from the sky in flashes of glinting scale, but my thoughts were on the breach. I'd have mere seconds when the time came, when I finally had the orb. I knew then the terrible pressure Dorian once faced, and I could only pray to match his focus. For an instant, his voice all but lilted in my ear. Well, I'm not surprised you'd think of me in your final moments, but come along now. We've a world to save. Cole laughed, a bright and borrowed sound. Downright unsettling, said Blackwell, panting as we topped the landing. It was wearing on him now, the weight of his armor and the endless climbing. If Salas were tiring, he showed no hint but for a white-knuckled grip on his stave. I felt the false strength of restoratives and lyrium, but beneath it the steady pull of power in my palm. We reached a stretch of stairs where nothing of the tower remained to shelter us from the sky. A knot of snarling amethyst and emerald dove passed, dragons plunged through the air clawing, slashing, screaming, falling, then pulling apart to fight for higher ground. With their cries to spur us on, the final stretch passed in a blur and we burst out from the tower into Mofaretha's shadow. The gauntlet. Or what was left of it. The walls fell away to reveal the scope of a battle that spanned the sky. The dragons raced between the towers that twisted in slow orbits around us, then doubled back again to glide across the open expanse beneath the breach. Morrigan darted through a narrow pass, close enough for jagged rock to scrape her scales. The blighted dragon was reckless in its pursuit, careening against the outcrop and screeching in rage. Fury shot it forward, but Morrigan lurched out of reach to heave herself higher than before. Once, twice, then again she heft up on leather wings, while the Elder One's dragon climbed in lazy circles. The sound of their wings was lost amid peals of thunder, giving the impression they flew in eerie silence. Blackwell came to stand beside me, tipping back the visor of his helmet to squint up at the glowing skies. Does she mean to take it through the breach? Quite the opposite. Even as Salas said the words, Morrigan tucked her wings and screamed. My heart dropped with her as she fell, head first, a cannonball of dragon bone and scale. She slammed talons first into the other dragon and they plunged. One dark wing lashed out and snapped, a sick, wet crunch that sent them into a tailspin. I held my breath, waiting to see which one would land on top, but then they were out of sight, out of sky, and the whole world lurched at their impact. Morrigan. I took off, flinging myself up and over the crenellations to a small disk of earth dragged up in the wake of the temple. A mind blast cushioned my fall, and I hit the ground running, felt the grass between my toes. The purple-skinned dragon lay in a tangled heap, tail lashing as it struggled to stand. It was a massive thing and gravely injured, oh gods, but it could still glide away and Morrigan was nowhere to be found. If I'd screamed in pain when Corypheus attacked, it was soul-sick determination that drove it from me now. Amalia flew out ahead to drape herself around it like a shroud, singing blood into my veins. I came skidding to a halt with the swell of ancient power, more than I could possibly contain. My fingers flew across the veil and I threw my arms open wide. Electricity burned along the patterned air, a barrage of raw energy channeled straight from my core, 6 quick convulsions before I was released. The dragon reared back to bat away the orbs of light that swarmed around it, then screamed and clutched a foreleg to its chest. In a flash of blue, it was caught in a column of ice as Salas and Blackwell appeared beneath it. I ran for higher ground while the dragon hissed against the crash of Blackwell's shield, and I turned in time to see it swat him back. By then Cole had circled round to have at the ice-damaged leg, while Salas coaxed out frost runes to slow it down. There'd be no containing a dragon in a static cage, but I cast it just the same, knotting up the energy of the veil just across its back. Lightning bolted around its wings and Blackwell's sword glinted with electric light, then I smiled as a familiar barrier brushed against my skin. Salas stood at edge of my peripheral vision, falling into an easy rhythm as he cast. I spared a glance in his direction while I wove a chain of lightning, startled to discover him looking at me already, eyes flashing with something I couldn't explain. It was. The dragon screamed and my world went black, but I didn't need to see. I threw lightning and Salas drew ice, then we fainted back when the dragon turned. When it spun again, Cole and Salas moved in unison, flashing blades and a glimmer of fade to strip its guard. Blackwell crouched at its back, swinging his weight into a strike that slashed deep enough to sever tendon from bone. On and on it went, the four of us attacking and retreating, slowly shifting across the field, but through it all I couldn't help but notice the change. Salas moved with rare determination, not grim but expectant. I'd seen him face certain death, I'd seen him die, but I'd not seen this Salas in battle since the day we met. Back when? A furious wind kicked up around as the dragon danced into the air on a broken wing. Salas grabbed my arm to keep the vortex from pulling me in, but I could feel the grass dragging through my toes and he lost me. For a second it was churning confusion in the eye of the storm, dodging legs and talons with dust in my eyes, catching sight of blades black with blood. In a moment more I found my footing, managed 2 aimless shots before I broke away. Once I reached higher ground, I turned in time to see Blackwell rake his sword across the dragon's belly, all the invitation Amalia needed to dive into its veins. I waited, watching, conserving mana, until I knew she'd taken hold, then let an explosion of disease and pestilence rip through its heart. Now. I folded the veil and jumped, landing close enough to strike across its throat. The dragon snapped its jaws and lunged, but I was already rolling beneath it, leaping to spear it with the blade of my staff. I threw my weight against it, felt the tip scrape bone and blood splash hot across my chest before losing my grip in the spray. The dragon reared back on its hind legs, wings churning for balance and pumping out blood with every desperate thrash. I was paralyzed by the monstrous size of it above, silhouetted in the light of the breach. Oh, gods, let this be it. Armored boots pounded across the hard-packed earth, and the air was knocked from my lungs. The whole world rushed backwards in an avalanche of silverite and steel, spinning confusion and bone-shaking impact. Everything went still. I saw darkness, then a sliver of moonlight on silver, inhaled the scent of human sweat. Blackwell rolled off me and onto his back, breastplate heaving, and I wheezed around a putrid gust of the dragon's dying breath. Sticky warmth slid over my ears, and I spun to find its maw close enough to touch. I scrambled away as a tangle of mana crackled across its scales, coalescing as a wisp of light, the spark of a soul. A streak of crimson shot up to where Apotheosis stood in the arch of a long broken window, a slash of black against the darkened sky. He staggered under the blow, struck mortal, and my breath caught when he raised the orb. Let it end here. Let the skies boil, let the world be rent asunder. The breach throbbed at his command, and with it the anchor. I bolted forward, yanking loose my stave and racing toward the base of the tower, doubling up the veil to burst up the stairs. Nothing and no one else mattered now. Only the orb. Fade-touched lightning struck at the top of the landing, the whole tower shook with thunder. I dodged a shower of rubble and stone, banked left up a flight of stairs. Light from the fade illuminated my climb, and somewhere further ahead a booming voice rose above the chaos. No, I will not allow you this victory. You, and all the heathen barbarians, shall burn. I came to a skidding halt where the ground fell away, a chasm gaping beneath the open sky. A whole city of blackened ruins hung from the clouds, rising up to meet the breach. Oh, gods, it was getting bigger, ordering the waking world into the shape of the fade. I dropped down to the level below, pulling a barrier tight around me as I eased up the stairs. Apotheosis stood in the corner of a once grand chamber, the broken tile of a mosaic beneath his feet. Blighted red magic crawled across the stone, bounding and rebounding from red lyrium crystals that littered the floor. The orb floated in the perfect center, held aloft by some corruption. Amalia purred with satisfaction, he was fully human now. She lashed out with terror, the memory of an empty throne, and it was fear in his eyes when he saw me. A fresh swell of electricity poured from my stave, jolting out across the room. Corypheus was too powerful to be stunned, but he was wounded and swatting, surprised to discover a gnat knew how to sting. He was such a fool, could have fought forever if only knowing not to risk his prize. A blizzard whipped up around him, and his robes grew heavy with frost. He summoned poisoned magic into a beam of pure light, but Blackwell was unmoved beneath the onslaught, unbreakable beneath his shield. I staked the Magi stir with lightning, and when he fainted left Cole was at his right, twin fangs sinking into the meat of his thigh. You dare come before me, demon? I will bind you, as I have bound so many before. I glimpsed a trembling spirit in my arms, begging to be bound, the amulet we gave him, the spell Salas cast, the Templar he didn't kill. Corypheus couldn't see compassion beneath him, but 1,000 cuts sprang up blood red against his hide. I am unbound, he whispered. And you are undone. The impact of Blackwell's shield sent him reeling, and then a sword shanked against his side. Amalia struck again, forcing her way into the wound, and he convulsed with her disease. No, he cried. I will not allow you this victory. Corypheus stretched his arms out wide and summoned the orb. Tendrils of raw energy writhed all around, and he consumed that dark magic until his eyes became glowing embers, 2 points of crimson light. I had a split second to register the wave of force magic, just enough time to hold my breath. I landed flat on my back, head cracking against the floor and fingers curling around empty air. My stave was gone. Gods give me strength, All-Mother protect me just a moment more. My vision swam as I turned toward his panicked voice. Not like this. I have walked the halls of the Golden City, crossed the ages. He'd lost sight of me completely as he wrestled with the orb. He wasn't even touching it, but sparking it, twisting and turning in a struggle for control. The orb reacted like a magnet joined at the wrong pole, slippery and repellent. Pain hammered behind my eyes as I rolled to press blistered palms against the blackened stone. Then the anchor flared, driving back the haze in a moment of perfect clarity. The orb was mine. Oh! I remembered the feel of it, the way it once rolled into the palm of my hand, the weight of its magic, and its offer. I hadn't stolen the anchor, I'd claimed it. I looked down in wonder, then turned to the pretender who'd never understood. One does not obtain permission. One obtains the right. Dumat. Ancient ones. I beseech you. Corypheus was panicked and humbled by death on his door. Just a boy, helpless and alone, everything and everyone he'd ever known 10 centuries dead. If you exist, if you ever truly existed, aid me now. I reached out and palmed the veil. The anchor sparked, every fiber of my being aligning itself to the orb. A shimmering thread ran between us, one that couldn't be cut or broken, and with a tug it came flying home. It floated there in my palm, content. In it I saw an emerald forest that spanned the world, endless green grass beneath its branches, and centuries of verdant moss crawling across the stone. Somewhere in the distance, Corypheus collapsed to his knees, but I saw only still water in a sheltered grove. I was naked, wading into its depths and cupping my hands to drink. It was lifetime after lifetime of Ramana conserved into a single pool, and I let the anchor slip beneath the surface to drag me down. Whatever god it belonged to could have me. I hadn't come to drink. I'd come to drown. 10 millennia of hoarded magic poured through me, a fountain of light to pierce the veil. The magic shifted, resonating higher, flowing faster than before, splashing into the fade and rippling back across the sky. My eyes snapped open when the orb fell lifeless at my feet, the sum of its power running through my palm. The anchor couldn't contain it any more than needle contains a thread, but it was mine to weave between the worlds. I remembered Corypheus on his knees before me, towering and yet so very small. I closed the distance between us to cup his misshapen cheek, slack and useless where the orb had broken his jaw. You wanted into the fade. I tore a rift in the heart of him, unraveling the fabric of his existence from the inside out. He jerked and screamed while he still had a mouth to shape the air, but then he did not. He was not, and the veil knit itself around his absence. A hush fell over the world, and we were falling. I caught the veil around the ruins like a sling to slow our descent, but it was beyond my skill to hold. The thread was pulling from my grasp, and I could feel myself losing consciousness, but no matter. A little longer and darkness. I was first aware of the mundanity of my breathing, then cold winter air in my lungs, and the steady beating of my heart. I stretched myself to feel the shallow pool of my emptied mana, Amalia nestled beneath my ribs, and the anchor in my palm. When I opened my eyes, the sky shimmered incandescent across the memory of the breach. It was nearly dawn. I heard nothing but evergreens bending with the wind, the gentle rustle of their snowy limbs. I took one breath, then another, stunned to be alive. Eventually, I found the strength to roll onto my hands and knees, to stagger forward without my stave, exhausted body and soul. Everything hurt. I swallowed and meant to shout, but the sound barely rasped from my throat. Where was Cole? I stumbled through the ruins in a daze, heartsick in search of the others. Creators, please, no. I'd been the sole survivor in this temple one too many times before. The distant scuff of skin on stone was deafening, and my whole body twisted toward the sound. Salas. Oh, gods, my Salas. I ran barefoot to where he climbed the stairs, worried at the strangeness of his gait. He walked as though wounded, hamstrung by an injury that defied my gaze. Then his steps quickened and I watched him kneel before the broken orb. Carefully, he reached for what I'd left behind, rocking back on his heels to regard the shattered fragments with his own eyes. I wavered at the top of the stairs, sick with the memory of something he'd said in Haven. Salas. If he heard me, he showed no sign, and I took another cautious step before the fragile tenor of his voice stopped me cold. The orb. I'd stood beside him as wisdom faded to dust, but I'd never heard him so lost. In the heat of the moment, everything seemed perfectly clear, but now the focus of a creator had been reduced to lifeless rock, untold potential destroyed by my hand. What could we have accomplished for the people if I'd even tried to save it? My mouth went dry. I'm so sorry. It is not your fault, he said, stumbling over the word. Salas gently set the orb aside, then pushed up on one knee to stand. I watched him struggle to quiet his grief before turning to fix his eyes on mine, expression softening to something plaintive. My heart clenched with the certainty of what I'd tried to deny. There's more, isn't there? He shook his head, for once having nothing to hide. It was not supposed to happen this way. His voice was paper-thin as he turned from me, head bowed beneath the weight of confession. I held my breath against the kernel of suspicion that lodged in my chest, denying it room to grow. Oh, gods. No matter what happens, he said. I want you to know that what we had was real. Vihanan. Lath. Please. I licked my lips, but the words wouldn't come. He was searching for something too, but it was Cassandra's frantic cries that broke the silence between us. Inquisitor. Are you alive? Instinct turned me round, and I wavered but a moment. He hadn't waited this long to confess before a human audience, and deserved no less than my full attention. There would be time enough for explanation in the months to come. There was so much I wanted to tell him in turn. About Mithil and Kiran, all that I'd seen in the Fade, and what it meant to bear the anchor without an orb. But for now I had one last duty, and he needed time to mourn. I was loath to let him go, but picked my way down the ruined stairs in good faith. Salas once promised all would be made clear, and I was not so shemlin to demand that it be now. If what he said was true, then we hadn't reached the end, but a new beginning. Check the description for the links to the author.